Chapter 12. Weapons and Implements. Stone hatchets and knives. Nature of stone weapon is determined primarily by that of the material available: spears, various types, clubs and throwing sticks, various types, spear throwers. Bags and baskets, various types, trumpets, fire-making and cooking, challenge sticks, rasp, spindle, fan, corroboree wand, boats. There is much similarity amongst the more important weapons and implements made and used by the mainland tribes in the Northern Territory, and most of them have been fully described already by various writers. The most characteristic weapons are, 1. Stone hatchets and picks, the latter of which do not apparently extend farther north than, approximately, Daly Waters. 2. Stone knives. 3. Spears, either wooden or bone-barbed or stone-headed. 4. Spear throwers of various forms, and 5. Fighting sticks or clubs. Stone hatchets and knives. At the present day it is not common to meet with stone hatchets except amongst the tribes in far outlying parts, and these are so wild that white men very seldom come in contact with them. For very many years past, the natives, partly through intercourse with whites, and partly, along the seaboard, through intercourse with Malays and others, have been well acquainted with the use of iron. Amongst the northern central tribes, we have previously described in detail the nature and manufacture of their stone hatchets, picks and knives 56 and, in all important respects. What we wrote concerning these tribes is true of those with which I am now dealing. As I have pointed out before, the terms Eolithic, Paleolithic and Neolithic have no meaning whatever when used in connection with culture stages or periods in reference to Australia. The one thing that stands out clearly, is that the nature of the stone weapon, or implement, used by an Australian Aboriginal is determined, primarily, by the nature of the material available. If he lives where he can secure only quartzite, or some such rock, then he makes chipped and flaked implements. These may be as crude as the crudest so-called Paleolithic implements, or they may be as beautifully and delicately chipped as the finest arrowheads found in European prehistoric collections. If he lives where he can secure diorite and rocks of that nature, then he grinds his stone implements and, if he lives where he can obtain both quartzite and diorite, then he makes flaked, chipped and ground implements. Just according to what material lies handiest. It is no uncommon thing, or was not until the northern central tribes came into contact with foreigners, to find one man carrying with him, at one and the same time, a ground and hafted stone axe, a flaked pick, a flaked stone knife, and a few small, crudely flaked, or perhaps flaked and chipped stones. He might even have also a beautifully chipped spearhead and, at the same time, you would find him using in camp a stone that he had just picked up and roughly flaked to serve some passing need. Sonic indeed, of their stone implements are so crude that, if found fossil, they would only be recognized as being of human manufacture by those who have had personal experience of the Australian Aboriginal, and have actually seen him at work. And even then in many cases it would be difficult to be absolutely sure. It is not, I think, too much to say that we can now, amongst Australian stone implements, find parallels for all the various types that have been described elsewhere, and the interesting feature is that they all exist and either now are, or until very recently have been, in use side by side. Tribes like the Larrakia, Wargate, Warai and others have practically no stone weapons left. They use iron or, perhaps, if they do not happen to have a white man's knife or hatchet with them, they may use a flaked stone which is thrown aside as soon as it has served its temporary purpose. Amongst the less contaminated tribes of the interior, hatchets, knives and picks are still met with, though, yearly, in decreasing numbers. Amongst the coastal tribes two influences have been at work tending to lessen the importance of stone-cutting implements. In the first place the natives have, for long years past, secured a certain supply of iron hatchets and knives from Malays and others visiting the northern coasts of Australia in search of trepang and tortoiseshell. In the second place they have found that shells, such as a large species of Sirena, very common on Melville and Bathurst Islands, make admirable cutting and scraping tools. The result is that stone implements of all kinds are now comparatively rare. On Plate 12. For specimens of hafted stone axes are illustrated which are interesting because of their crudeness. Figs 1, 2, and 3 are from the Kakadu tribe on the Alligator River. In the first specimen the stone is evidently a naturally wedge-shaped pebble of diorite. It measures 6 3/4 inches in length, 3 in greatest width and, in thickness, diminishes from 1 1/4 inches to 3/4 of an inch just above the cutting edge. The latter has been worked on both sides. In the second and third the stone is also a diorite pebble. The second has evidently had chips knocked off the side which lies to the right in the figure, and both surfaces, close to the cutting edge, have been ground to a slight extent. The third has one surface left in its natural condition, the one seen in the figure has been roughly worked and there is just a slight, but only a very slight, indication of grinding close around the cutting edge. In each of these three specimens, the handle has the form of a bent withy, passing round close to the wider end of the stone, which, together with the withy, is enclosed in a mass of beeswax. Fig. 4, which came from Melville Island, represents the crudest hafted axe that I have ever seen in Australia. 57 It is simply a roughly shaped block of ferruginous sandstone, measuring 6 1/2 inches in length, 4 1/4 in width, and 2 1/4 in greatest thickness. It has been very roughly flaked so as to reduce it to its present shape and to form, also, what must have been a very unserviceable cutting edge, but there has been no attempt at grinding. It is the only example, that I have seen in Australia, of a hafted axe which has been flaked and not ground. The withy passes almost round the center of the stone, to which it is attached by capay, that is a hard, brittle resin, derived from the root of the ironwood tree, Lesconhaltia sp, the two halves being tightly bound together by strips of bark. Spears. In regard to spears there is very considerable variety. Most of the types, however, that are met with in the Northern Territory have been already described and are well known. 58 We have previously described 11 types as follows. 1. The heavy unbarbed spear of the Arunta tribe, with flattened blade. 2. The barbed spear of the Arunta, peculiar to this tribe and the Luritja. 3. The unbarbed spear of the Arunta with separate, flattened, head and shaft. 4. Single-pronged, multi-barbed spears, with the barbs on one side only. The shaft distinct from the head and made of either light or heavy wood. 5. Single-pronged, multi-barbed spears, with shafts of light wood or reed. The barbs are arranged along 2 or more sides of the head. 6. Multi-pronged, multi-barbed spears, with shafts of light wood or reed. 7. Unbarbed spear, with single, flattened, wooden point attached to a reed shaft. 8. Stone-headed spear, with the head made of flaked quartzite and the shaft of reed. 9. Stone-headed spear, with the head made of chipped slate and the shaft of reed. 10. Stone-headed spear with the head made of chipped opalescent quartzite. The main part of the shaft is of reed, onto which a short length of hard wood is hafted. 11. Short, light spears, with a thin tapering point of hard wood and a reed shaft, used for spearing fish. 12. The single-pronged hafted, bone-tipped spear, called jaboru by the Kakadu, Plate 13, Figure 2. 13. The four-pronged, hafted, bone-tipped spear, called kujorju by the Kakadu, Plate 13, Figure 3. To these we may now add the following types. 14. Single-pronged, long, unbarbed and unshafted spear, round and pointed. The Walunka of the Melville and Bathurst Island natives, Plate 13, Figure 1. 15. The single-pronged, unhafted, heavy spear, with barbs on one side only, called anergich on Melville Island, Plate 14, Figures 8 and 9 and 10 and 11. 16. The single-pronged, unhafted, heavy spear, with barbs on both sides, called junculetti on Melville Island, Plate 15. 17. The double-pronged, unhafted, unbarbed, heavy spear on Melville Island, Plate 13, Figure 5. 18. The double-pronged, unhafted, barbed heavy spear on Melville Island, Plate 13, figure 4. 19. The short, reed-hafted, sharp wooden-pointed spear, called conjolio by the Kakadu. In June, 1911, on Melville Island, I saw, for the first time, the remarkable spears that are characteristic of this and Bathurst Island, and again, in 1912, saw many more of the same type, and also one or two new and interesting types amongst the Kakadu and allied tribes. In all the latter the commonest spear is type 4, as described above. It is not actually made by the Kakadu natives, but by a tribe called Koluonglechi, who trade it to the former in exchange for another special form of spear called conjolio. There are two forms: the ordinary barbed spear called erpool and the curious one in which the barbs are indicated, but, though a series of holes is cut through the blade, the edge of the latter is left intact. This is called yerapul, or Michael, by the Kakadu, and is not uncommonly met with in the tribes inhabiting the country on the Gulf of Carpentaria and along the northern coast. The spear, type 5, with barbs along each side, is also common, and is called michapali. A new form that I had not seen before is represented in plate 13, figure 2. It is called jaboru. Its total length is 9 feet 8 inches, the greater part of which consists of a thin shaft of hardwood only, at most, 3/4 of an inch in diameter. At the handle end there is a short length of reed or bamboo measuring 12 inches and made so that the point of a spear thrower can be fitted into it. At the opposite end there is a single sharpened bone, which projects for 1.25 inches from a small mass of hard kapay, that is, the resin derived from the root of the ironwood tree. Amongst the Kakadu, Gaimbio, Umoriu, and Iwaji tribes there is one special form of spear peculiar, so far as I am aware, to this part of the country. It is called, by the Kakadu, Kujorju or Kumbada, and is shown in plate 13, figure 3. The total length is only 5 feet 3 inches. It consists, essentially, of 4 prongs of hard wood, and a short length of bamboo, into which they are inserted. The prongs are free for just 3 feet. From this point downwards towards the handle they are arranged around a central stick, immediately above which a pad of paper bark is inserted between the prongs, which are then bound tightly round outside for 4 inches. First with banyan bark string and then with split cane. As the natives say, Rankanaraji, Bori Ganji, that is, paper bark inside, string outside. The result is that, as shown in the figure, the prongs are divergent at their free ends. Beyond the split cane the 4 prongs and central stick are uncovered, then comes a length of bamboo measuring 12 inches, into which they are inserted, fitting tightly. For some 6 inches the upper part of the bamboo is wound round with banyan string, evidently to prevent it from splitting, as the pressure is considerable. Each prong ends in a sharp pointed bone, 1 inch long, projecting from a rounded mass of kapay resin. This special form of spear is never decorated with color and is mainly used for catching fish and the large freshwater snake, called tirajuno, of which the natives are very fond. A third type is called conjolio and is made especially by the Kakadu. It is only a small one, usually not longer than about 5 feet, but is much the most dangerous one when thrown by an expert native. It has a sharp end, tapering almost to a needle point, called majariyu and made out of a hardwood known as ainya, a species of acacia. The shaft is of marlu, or bamboo, colored with cuteri, the ordinary red ochre. A few inches at the lower end may have resin put round it colored with nungorli, the burnt red ochre. It always has a hole, called munjan jil, into which the spear thrower fits. This is, really, though small and light, only weighing a few ounces, the most effective weapon that the Kakadu native possesses. It can be hurled with great speed and accuracy of aim, and has wonderful penetrating power. The spears made by the Melville and Bathurst Islanders are remarkable by reason of their, relatively, ponderous weight and size, and also because of their characteristic decorations. They might better be described as javelins. They are all made of wood, and amongst the many scores that I have seen and handled, there has not been a single hafted one, though there are indications, on some, that hafting may have been once employed. At the present day each is made out of a single piece of wood, and may be divided into 5 groups, or types, a representative series of which is illustrated in plates 13, 14, and 15. The first consists of a simple long, round, unbarbed and sharply pointed stick. PL 13, Figure 1. This particular specimen measures 8 feet 4 inches in length, and for about 1/3 of its length is ornamented with alternating bands of white, yellow, and red, otherwise it is perfectly plain and simple. The second consists of single-pronged spears with barbs on one side only. They seldom measure less than 10 feet in length. There are 2 kinds of single-barbed spears, though to a certain extent they merge into one another. In one kind, as seen in Plate 14, Figures 1 and 2 and 3 and 6 and 7, the barbs are relatively small and, more or less, widely separated from one another. The Melville Island name for these is Walunka. The one represented in Fig. 1 is exceptionally short, measuring only 7 feet 7 inches in length, and only 3/4 of an inch in diameter. The barbs, of which there are 9 altogether, only extend for a distance of 17 inches from the end. The decorations consist of broad bands of white and red with much narrower ones of yellow. The one represented in Figure 2 is much the same except that it measures 10 feet 3 inches in length. Figure 6 shows a somewhat different form. It measures 11 feet 5 inches in length and has 9 barbs, the point of the last barb being 22 inches from the tip. This is succeeded by a length of 7 inches, the surface of which, corresponding in position to the barbs, is marked by 14 serrations. The decoration is very distinctive and is of the type more clearly seen in Figure 10 and again in Fig. 5 on Plate XXXVI. The background of the whole of the barbed part is black. There is a white line along each side, alternate barbs are crossed by white and yellow lines and there is a definite pattern of the same along the back of the barbed part. The remainder of the spear is decorated with broad bands of white, red and yellow. Specimens such as those shown in Figures 4 and 5 lead on to the second series of the single-barbed forms. The barbs increase in size and are placed more closely together. Figures 8 and 9, the 10th and the 11th of may be regarded as typical of this form of spear which is called onergich. The one represented in Figure 4 measures 10 feet 6 inches in length. There are 21 barbs, the point of the first is 9 inches, and that of the last 46 inches from the tip. The greatest width across the barbs is 2 inches and the longest barb measures 4 3/4 inches. Each one, in shape, is very much like a scale on a pine cone. It is attached to the blade of the spear by a very thin flattened stalk which swells out into a thicker part with a very distinct ridge leading to the point. In Fig. 10 we have a very characteristic form. It measures 11 feet 5 inches in length and has 19 barbs, the point of the last one being 52 inches from the tip of the spear. The last barb has a total length of 10 inches. Immediately beyond the barbs there is a length of 4 inches where the blade is flattened from side to side and ornamented with serrations. Beyond this again there is a length of 3 inches wound round with vegetable fiber string. This is very suggestive indeed of hafting. In fact, in the case of any ordinary spear from the mainland, the binding round with string in this part might safely be taken as a proof of hafting. The decoration of this specimen, also, is very characteristic. The groundwork of the blade is black, the barbs are some of them black with red bands and white spots, others are red with white bands, others are black with white bands. In essential features it is similar to the colored illustration, Figure 5 on Plate XXXVI. Figure 11, which has a total length of 9 feet 5 inches, is a very good example of the type called, by the Melville Islanders, onergich. There are 29 barbs, long, thin and close set, occupying a length of 42 inches back from the tip of the spear, which tapers to a very sharp point just 10 inches in front of the first barb. The whole of the surface in each of the 3 upper spears is marked with fine longitudinal grooves, right from the tip to the end of the handle. In some of the spears only the head end is grooved, the shaft being scraped. In others the whole surface is scraped. In most the shaft has been more or less carefully straightened, if it was not so to begin with, by heating it over a slow fire, but, in some cases, as in that of fig. 9. The terminal third is very twisted and crooked. In all cases the handle end tapers to a point, and there is no indication of a hole for the insertion of a spear thrower, the use of which is not known, so far as I could ascertain, on either Melville or Bathurst Island. A third, very characteristic, type is represented by the specimens shown on plate 15. They are called junculeti, on Melville Island, and are cut out of the solid, various forms of wood being employed. The three upper ones are in process of manufacture out of iron wood and show the manner in which the barbs are cut. The surface was so smooth that at first I thought they must be cut by a knife, but this was not so. The native whom I watched at work had no knife but used the sharp edge of a bivalve shell, Serena sp, which is very abundant on the coast, and forms a most excellent cutting implement. He first of all carefully incised lines, indicating the outline of a barb, and then cut deeper and deeper until the barb was completely outlined. It was a work of infinite patience, and yet they readily parted with these spears for a stick or two of tobacco. Figure 4 was relatively a short one, measuring 10 feet. It has 15 barbs on each side, arranged, as is the case in all these spears, quite symmetrically on either side the middle line. The greatest width across the barbs, which are, relatively, flat, broad and short, is 4 inches. The whole surface has been smoothed, and it will be noticed that immediately beyond the barbs there is a length of 2.5 inches tied round with string, which has been covered with beeswax and then whitened. Exactly as if the head were hafted on to the shaft. By means of the scheme of color decoration the barbs are divided into 3 successive series, lying one behind the other. The tip end of the spear is red, a central line of the same color extending down the middle to the imitation hafting. On one side the successive series are yellow, white, yellow, on the other they are white, yellow, white, this alternation of colors being eminently characteristic of the decorative schemes of the islanders. The dark cross lines are red. The spear represented in figure 5 measures 12 feet 1 inch. There are only 11 barbs on each side, which are somewhat more elongate than those in the first spear. Immediately behind the barbs, the greatest width of which is 4 inches, a square opening has been cut through, marking the termination of the blade. Point 59. Figure 6 represents one of the longest spears. It measures 13 feet 3 inches, with a maximum width across the barbs of 2 3/4 inches. There are 21 barbs on each side. The blade, from the very point to the tip of the last barb, has a length of exactly 5 feet. Immediately behind the barbs are 4 rings of abra seed set in beeswax. The whole surface is scraped smooth. Figure 7 is an admirable example of one special form in which the barbs are few in number, only 5 in this specimen. They increase markedly in size from the point towards the shaft, and the distance between the points of successive barbs is very great as compared with the other specimens. The decoration is also very characteristic, and the old hafting is indicated by a flattened band, grooved on both its upper and lower surfaces, and decorated with abra seeds on both sides. Figs 8, 9, and 10 are characteristic examples of junculeti, in which the barbs are numerous, close-set, and narrow across from side to side. In the specimen represented in Fig. 9 there are 33 barbs, the tip of the last one lying 44 inches behind the point of the spear. These spears are extraordinary structures, and might better be called javelins. Mr. Cooper and myself investigated the throwing capacity of some of the men. The spear we chose for the purpose was a double-barbed junculeti, a good average specimen, measuring 10 feet 6 inches in length and 4 pounds in weight. The throwing took place on the open beach, where the sand was hard and afforded a good foothold. The spear was, of course, thrown with the hand, no spear thrower being known in Melville Island, figure 72. We gave the 9 men who competed for the prize that we offered, a tomahawk, 3 tries each, and allowed them a preliminary run of 20 feet. They entered with zest into the competition, which was watched with interest by the other men in camp. It was interesting to note the varying degrees of ability, not only in regard to distance but to accuracy of aim displayed by the competitors. As a matter of fact, there was comparatively little accuracy, and provided, of course, only one or two spears were thrown, there would be no difficulty in avoiding them. The distances thrown were as follows. No. 1. 143 feet. 5 inches. Number 2. 128. 4. Number 3. 126. 4. Number 4. 123. 4. Number 5. 122. 9. Number 6. 112. 8. No. 7. 109. 9. Number 8. 109. 4. Number 9. 104. 3. The fourth type of spear is a rare one. It is double-pronged, cut out of the solid and barbed. The specimen represented in Fig. 4 on plate 13. Measures 12 feet 9 inches in length. The barbs, of which there are 22 on each side, are arranged with perfect symmetry and, as usual, the color alternates on the two sides. On the one prong it is red with narrow, white cross bands, and on the other white with narrow red bands. The fifth type of spear is a rare one. It is double-pronged, cut out of the solid, and unbarbed. In the specimen represented in Fig. 5, plate 13, the total length is 7 feet 9¼ inches. The prongs measure 32 inches in length, and the distance between their points is 1 3/4 inches. Like many other parts of Australia, the boys on Melville and Bathurst Islands make toy spears. They take short lengths of stick, 2 feet 6 to 3 feet in length, and sharpen one end to form a point. The other they leave blunt. When being thrown it is held in the right hand, sometimes with the forefinger against the blunt end just as if it were the point of a spear thrower. The boys divide into two opposing parties and, stationed at a distance of perhaps 10 or 12 yards from one another, indulge in a mimic fight, one side throwing and the other dodging. They are remarkably clever both in aiming and in dodging, and any specially good shot, or clever avoidance of the same, is much appreciated. Out in the scrub also they are continually cutting off lengths of reed and aiming these at one another. Clubs and throwing sticks. On the mainland there are at least 4 main types met with, each of which is represented on plate 16. They are used by one or other of the northern coastal tribes, and I collected all the 4 types figured amongst the Kakadu tribe on the East Alligator River. Figs 1, 2, and 3 represent a very common form of club that has often been described. It is made of hard wood, is always circular in section and blunt at both ends. Of the 3 figured, the longest measures 5 feet 1 3/4 inches, and the shortest 4 feet 8 inches. The handle end may be daubed over with beeswax, the opposite, which is slightly the broader of the two, is ornamented in various ways, with lines and bands of white, black and red. Fig. 4 represents a club which is also common but of very constant form and always well made. It is somewhat flattened with a broader end, bluntly pointed, and a narrower one which is always marked by a very distinct concavity. The one figured, both in shape, size and decoration, may be taken as a very typical form of this club, which the Kakadu tribe call parapiriu. The Iwagi, at Port Essington, where the first example was seen and described by McGillivray in his Voyage of the Rattlesnake, call it miru. The specimen has a total length of 58 inches and a maximum breadth of 3½ In section it is slightly, but distinctly, biconvex. The general surface is dull red ochre in color, but a special bright red ochre is used for the tip and the 5 bands that run across from side to side. The 2 broad bands are ornamented with fine, cross-hatched white lines leaving lozenge and crescent-shaped areas of dull red. There is a narrow median band with a row of white circles and 4 short slanting lines attached to each. This is a very characteristic form of decoration for these instruments. The handle end is distinctly flattened. For a distance of 15 inches it has been smeared over with beeswax, between 2 lines of white, and the terminal 5 inches is bound round with vegetable fiber string. The 2 remaining types are much rarer and more restricted in their distribution. I do not think that they are found to the west of the Alligator River country. The one represented in Fig. 5 is used by the Iweji at Port Essington and the Kulangletji and Gaimbio tribes to the southeast, but is not made by the adjoining Kakadu or Umoria tribes. It is called Mabobo or Wakati. The one figured measures 47 inches in length and is decorated in much the same way as the Parapiriu, from which it differs in being more club-like in form and in the shape of its blunt handle end. The 4th type, represented in Fig. 6, has much the shape of a bat, and is also made by the Kulangletji, who call it Wakarti or Wakati. The Kakadu name is Katamango. Its length is 41 inches and its greatest width 5 inches. It has a very distinct handle and the form of decoration is much the same as that of the Parapiriu and Mabobo. The above 4, together with the simple straight club met with in northern central tribes, such as the Warramunga and Chingili, represent the only types of this weapon met with on the mainland. It is, therefore, simply astonishing to cross from the latter to Melville and Bathurst Islands and meet, in such a small, restricted area, with a series of clubs and fighting sticks so varied as those represented on plates 16, 17, and 18. It is all the more remarkable when one realizes the fact that not more than a very few miles, easily crossed in a dugout canoe, separates the southeastern corner of Melville Island from Cobourg Peninsula on the mainland. Inhabited by the Iweji tribe, who have none of these. I have no doubt but that the Melville and Bathurst Islanders have other forms of clubs and fighting sticks beyond those now described. They will, however, probably differ from these only in detail. They may be, roughly, divided into 2 groups, A, single-pronged and, B, double-pronged. Amongst each of these there are many types. A, single-pronged. To take the single-pronged ones first, because they probably represent the simpler types. It is very difficult to classify them satisfactorily, but we may conveniently divide them first of all into 2 sets, A, those that are circular in cross-section and, B, those that are flattened or elliptical in cross-section. A, those that are circular in cross-section. These again are, more or less satisfactorily, divided into 2 groups, 1, those with blunt and, 2, those with pointed ends. Amongst the first of these we have 2 types. Type 1. A more or less curved stick, about 20 inches in length, with a very decided difference in the thickness of the handle and head end. Examples of this, which is perhaps the commonest form, are seen in plate 17, figures 10 and 11. The weapon is made of hard, dark, heavy wood, such as that of an acacia or ironwood, and the surface is decorated with strongly incised parallel grooves which curve round the head end and meet at a very blunt point, in some cases, indeed. There is a slight concavity towards which they all converge. The diameter of the swollen end is not more than 2 inches and the surface is variously decorated with bands of yellow, red and white. Type 2. An approximately straight stick, about 20 inches in length, or slightly more, with no strongly marked, swollen head, figure 9, plate 17. The surface is covered with incised grooves and decorated just as in the preceding form. Amongst those with pointed ends there are at least 5 types and there may be more. Type 3. A straight stick, plate 17, figure 7, with a very marked swollen head and a more or less rapidly tapering point. The surface is strongly grooved. In its widest part the diameter is 2 inches or slightly more. The Melville Island name for it is Muraguna. Type 4. A somewhat longer stick than the last one, measuring 30 inches or more, figure 6, plate 17. It gradually increases in size towards the head end, the greatest diameter of which is about all inch and quarter. It has a long tapering point. Type 5. This is a very characteristic form. It is made, like all the above, out of heavy dark wood and measures about 2 feet in length. It gradually increases in size towards the head end, which is bluntly rounded and has a sharp projecting point, 5/8 of an inch in length, Fig. 8, Plate 17. Type 6. This is a very remarkable type, Figure 5, Plate 17. It measures 27 inches in length, and, in general form, is intermediate between types 4 and 5. The head end is more swollen than in type 5, so much as in type 4. And the form of the tapering point is also intermediate between the two. It is remarkable, however, in having 2 distinct series of serrations on opposite sides of the swollen head. 60 The whole surface is strongly grooved. Type 7. This is an interesting type which is evidently a further development of, in one direction, type 6. The swollen head of the latter merges at each end into the main body. In this type, Plate 18, Fig. 8, the head part is of the same diameter throughout, and is distinctly marked off from the rest. It is also somewhat flattened sideways. The serrations, which are indicated in type 6, are here much more strongly marked, and, oil a small scale, are closely similar to the barbs of a spear. The total length is rather more than 30 inches, the pointed end. Beyond the head, measuring 10 inches. The coloration, the tip is white, followed by a red band. The serrations are red, the flattened surface on each side is yellow outlined with white, the handle has successive bands of red, red, yellow. Type 8. Just as type 7 appears to have been derived from type 6 by development of the serrated head part, so as to mark this off more distinctly from the body, so in type 8 development has gone, as were, in the opposite direction. It is represented by Figure 4 on Plate 18. It is 27 inches long, and the swollen head part, with serrations, is much larger than in type 6. The point also is much blunter. The swelling is so formed that one surface is nearly flat, the other very distinctly convex. On the upper, flat, surface there is a series of deeply cut serrations running across at right angles to the length of the club, but on what may be called the under surface, the serrations, which on type 6 were suggestive of spear barbs, are now very clearly of this nature. They are 7 in number, the longest measuring 4½ inches. The whole surface is marked with longitudinal grooves. The tip end is red, the upper, small, serrations are red, the lower barbs are white. On each side of the head the space between the serrations and barbs is outlined by a yellow band and crossed by 8 narrow bands of red, leaving square patches of dark-colored wood between them. The head is succeeded by a narrow band of red, then a still narrower one of white, and finally the rest of the handle is a bright orange-red. Type 9. This is much simpler in form than the preceding one, but, like it, may probably be derived from type 6. The swollen head part has practically disappeared, as have also the serrations on the upper part. Those on the lower side have been drawn out for a considerable distance, the last one being 19 inches away from the sharp-pointed tip, into which the original head now gradually tapers, Plate 17, Figure 3. B. Those that are flattened or elliptical in cross-section. Type 10. This is represented by the specimens show, on Plate 18, Figures 1, 2, and 3, and Plate 19, Figure 1. It varies somewhat in form but consists, essentially, of a flat slab of wood, varying in length from 2½ to 4 feet, in width from 2 to 3 inches, and its thickness is an inch, or a little less. A handle end may be indicated in various ways, as can be seen in the figures, but there are no serrations. The surface may be either grooved, Plate 18, Figs. 2 and 3, or roughly smoothed down, and the decoration takes the form of a series of bands of red, yellow and white. The Melville Island name for it is Iruela. Type 11. This is a much more ornate type, in which the handle end has serrations and both it and the blade may be pierced by openings. It is represented by the specimen on Plate 19, Figure 6. The total length is 54 inches. The greatest width 3 inches, and the thickness 1 inch. The decorations are crude but effective, the colors employed being yellow, red, black and white. A very characteristic feature of this and other of the island implements is seen in connection with the method of coloration of the middle and terminal parts. The whole surface is, first of all, coated with red ochre. This has then been covered with a thin layer of white which has in its turn been scratched through across to show the red beneath. Type 12. This is a very well marked and characteristic type, called Arawinagiri by the Melville Islanders. It is represented by figures 5 and 7 on plate 19. The natives told me that they used it for catching fish in the mangrove swamp. The man sits on a mangrove, above the water, and jabs it down on a passing fish. One would have thought that a sharp-pronged implement, such as is represented in the adjacent figure 8, would have been more serviceable for the purpose, but the natives were quite definite on the point. The total length of fig. 7, which is slightly larger than figure 5, the two being otherwise precisely similar to one another, is 55 inches. The head end is flattened, 21 inches in length, 2 3/4 inches in width, and 1 inch in thickness. It is succeeded by a round part, 1 inch in diameter and a foot in length. The next part for a distance of 14 inches is flattened and the same width as the blade. It carries, on each side, 6 barbs, which are precisely similar to those of the spears. The handle is rounded, with a knob in the middle. The most remarkable feature of this club is the strong development of the barbs which, apparently, are not only useless, but must be a source of danger to anyone holding the weapon and making a downward thrust. Because the points of the barbs are directed towards the handle end, and if the hand of the man using the weapon were to slip, the result would, inevitably, be a nasty wound. B. Double-pronged. There is very considerable variation amongst these both in size and form. The smallest of those illustrated, plate 17, figure 1, has a total length of 19 inches and a quarter, the longest, plate 19, fig. 8, measures slightly less than 72 inches. It is, in fact, rather difficult to know where to draw the line between clubs and spears, and to group the present series together, under the common heading of double-pronged, is really an arbitrary proceeding. It includes 2 distinct series, in one of which the prong indicates the handle, and in the other the opposite end of the weapon. A. Clubs in which the handle is pronged. Type 13. This includes a considerable series which cannot well be differentiated from one another. They differ much in regard to size and ornamentation but agree in the fundamental feature of possessing a prong which is relatively small and placed at what is evidently the handle end. They are represented by those illustrated it, figs 4, 5, and 6 on plate 18, and figures 2 and 3 and 4 on plate 19. The simplest and also most suggestive one, which gives us the clue to the true relation of the prong to the rest of the club, is the one shown in plate 19. Figure 4. It lies next to 3 simple unpronged ones and there can be no doubt whatever that the prong is the handle end and merely a further differentiation of the same part in the simpler forms. Also it is called Irawala or Iruela, just as the latter are. The others are merely variations of this, all of them with the widest and main part of the implement at the opposite end to the prong and, with very rare exceptions, some special feature to indicate that the prong is the handle end. In figure 4. For example, on plate 19, we have an admirable illustration. It measures just 4 feet in length, 3 inches in width, and 7/8 of an inch in thickness. The distance separating the points of the prongs is 2 inches and 3/8. The length of the prongs is 7 inches. Immediately beyond them vegetable fiber string is wound round for a space of 5 inches, in the way most characteristic of handles, and beyond this there are projecting ridges. From this the blade is uniform to the end, where it is bluntly rounded. Type 14. In this type I group a series of double-pronged forms of comparatively small size, in which the prong is at the opposite end to the handle. They are represented by the specimens illustrated on plate 17. Figures 1 and 2, and Plate 18, Figure 7. They vary somewhat in size and form. The prongs may be short and stout, or long and thin, but they are quite distinct from the handle end. Perhaps the commonest form is that represented in Plate 17, Figure 2. It measures 21 inches in length and 2 1/4 in greatest width, the prongs, to the end of the central incision, measuring 8 inches. It is made of very heavy wood, the prongs are beautifully shaped and very sharp, and the whole surface is covered with very regular, longitudinal grooves. The greatest relative length of prong is seen in Figure 7, Plate 18. When they measure 17 inches out of a total of 30. The least relative length is seen in Figure 1, Plate 17, where they measure only 2 1/2 out of 19 inches. Despite their variation, they are all members of the one type to which the natives give the common name of Japurunga or Taburaringa. Type 15. This is a very distinct type and, to a certain extent, is intermediate between a club and a spear. It is represented in Plate 19, Figure 8. Its total length is 71 inches and 1/4. Its general width is 3 inches and its thickness 1 inch, the proportions of these measurements being indicative of a club rather than a spear, the main shaft of which is typically circular, or nearly so, in section. The prongs measure 15 inches in length and, at the opposite end, there is a very well-marked handle, measuring 7 inches in length. The decorations are very characteristic and a portion of the club, drawn in colors, on a larger scale, on Plate XXXV and Fig. 1, serves admirably to illustrate the general color schemes of the Melville and Bathurst Island implements. Spear throwers. There are 4 types of spear throwers amongst the northern tribes, one of which is especially widely distributed, and is met with from the Kadish tribe, at Barrow Creek, in the south, right across the continent to the northern coast. Eastwards to the Gulf of Carpentaria, and westwards to the Indian Ocean. It has the form of a simple, straight, flattened blade of wood. It is usually made of a relatively light, soft wood, but may occasionally be made of a dark, heavy wood, such as an acacia. At one end the blade is cut away on both sides, so as to form a serviceable handle, which can be easily gripped. Sometimes, but by no means always, string or tendon is wound round this part. At the other end, towards which it usually slightly tapers, there is a mass of either resin or beeswax, into which a small wooden point is fixed. In most cases it is coated with red ochre, but sometimes it may be decorated with a definite pattern. It seldom exceeds a length of 3 feet 6 or 8 inches, and one of these implements is to be found amongst the possessions of almost every man amongst the northern tribes. In the central tribes, amongst the Warramunga tribe, it is called Wanmea. The Larakia name for it is Bleda, the Wargate is Callum. In the Larakia an important man is called Bleda Dunkel, which means a strong wamra, or spear thrower. In other words, a good, strong fighter. Bleda is also the name of the tree out of which the spear thrower is made. So, again, in the Wargate tribe, an important man is called Callum Kundira, which means a strong wamra. The other 3 types are much more limited in distribution. One of them consists of a straight stick, circular in section, and not more than 3 feet long. At one end it has a tassel of human hair string. This is really a fringe consisting of a long piece of fur string with twisted strands of hair string hanging down from it, very closely together. 61 At the opposite end there is a small knob of wax or resin with a little rounded knob of wood that fits into a small hole in the end of the spear. This type is met with especially amongst the Nanji and Umbea tribes, and, once more, I met with it along the coast of the Gulf of Carpentaria, but not in the more northern tribes, though it is said to have been met with amongst them. They certainly do not make it, but, of course, like everything else, spear throwers are traded from one part of the country to another. A third type, entirely peculiar to certain of the northern coastal tribes, is represented on Plate XX. Figs. 1 and 2 represented in course of manufacture, figures 3 and 4 show the finished article. It consists of a lath of hard, dark wood, such as an acacia, which may sometimes be straight, but is more usually distinctly curved, like a boomerang. The one represented in Figure 3 may be taken as very characteristic of this type. The total length, in a straight line, is just 4 feet, the greatest width is 2 inches and 5/8, and the thickness of the blade is only 3/16. The handle is a truncated knob of capet, or ironwood tree resin, measuring 2 3/4 of an inch in length and 1 3/4 in diameter. Its surface is worked in such a way as to give the appearance of strands of string running round either end and lengthwise across a band in the middle of the knob. The Kakadu, who make this form of spear thrower, call it palati. The wax knob is called kaliriu. At the other end there is a small knob of wood an inch in length and tapering rapidly from a diameter of 5/8 of an inch to a point. From the broader end there is a short projection, which is laid on one of the flat sides of the blade, and, after being enclosed in capet resin, is wound round and round with banyan fiber string. The wooden knob is called a nidi. This form of thrower requires considerable experience in its use, but is most effective in the hands of a skillful native, because, unlike most other throwers, the thin edge of the blade cuts through the air, resulting in there being practically no friction. Fig. 5 represents a very simple, distinct type, widely scattered amongst the northern coastal tribes who use the light, reed-hafted spear, called kanjolio by the Kakadu. It is merely a thin stick, from 40 to 45 inches in length and 1/4 to 1/2 of an inch in diameter. At the handle end it is coated with capet resin, with a raised rim about 5 inches from the end, which makes a very efficient handle. At the other end a small, pointed knob of capet is fixed on slantwise. Fig. 6 is merely a small edition of this, made and used by the children for their toy spears. Spear throwers belonging to one or another of these types are found amongst all the northern tribes except on Melville and Bathurst Islands, where they are entirely unknown. Bags and baskets. There are, according to the material out of which they are made, 4 main groups of baskets to be distinguished: 1. Those made out of palm leaves, 2. Those made out of paperbark for temporary use, 3. Those woven out of grass, rushes or split cane, and 4. Those made out of the bark of a gum tree. These are especially characteristic of Melville and Bathurst Islands. Knitted bags. A striking feature of all the northern coastal tribes is the absence of the wooden troughs, or pitchees, that are so characteristic of the central tribes. 1. Baskets made out of palm leaves. These are very ingeniously made. A fan palm leaf is taken with its attached stalk. While the leaf is soft and pliant, the free end is folded in such a way that there is a median and 2 lateral folds, as seen in Plate XXI, Figure 3. These 3 folds form the side of the basket opposite to that to which the leaf stalk is attached. The end of the stalk is bent over and then passed between the median fold and the 2 outer ones on the opposite side of the basket. It is then bent back on itself outside the latter. The edges of the folds, around the handle thus formed, are sewn together with thin split cane, the extent of the sewing varying much in different baskets. In the specimen figured, Plate XXI, the sewing is confined to the upper edge, but the line of split cane may follow round the margin of the outer fold till it comes to the turned-back leaf stalk, after which it may follow along the margin of the covered fold till it once more reaches the upper edge of the basket. These palm leaf baskets vary much in size. The one represented in Figure 2 measures 11 inches in greatest and 8 in least width, its depth being 9 inches. It has been covered externally with red ochre and then ornamented with white circles. Figure 3 is quite plain. It is 11 inches broad at the top and only 4 in its narrowest and lowest part. Figures 4 and 6 represent very small examples. In fact, the former is rather like a lady's large purse. Its greatest width is 4 inches and it is red ochred all over. It is, however, just as carefully made as the larger ones. In this particular instance the original attachment of the stalk is not used, probably because it would form too large a handle in proportion to the size of the basket. The leaf has therefore been folded on both sides, just as it is on one side only. It Figure 3, the edges of the folds have been sewn and the handle attached also in the same way. It seems a great deal of trouble to take, because the basket is so small that it only serves to hold very little. In this particular case it contained only a little red ochre. Fig. 6 represents also a small one, but here the attached stem is used as a handle. It is painted with red and yellow ochre, and ornamented with a flattened-out tassel, consisting of a central mass of beeswax whitened with pipe clay, from which radiate the hairs forming the terminal tuft of a dog's tail. These particular specimens came from the Alligator River, but similar ones are widely spread amongst the northern tribes. 2. Baskets made out of paper bark. In Plate XXI, Figures 1 and 5, two types of these are represented. The first is, roughly, rectangular in shape. It measures 8 inches in length by 4 in width, and the same in depth. The bark, which the Kakadu natives call rankin, is composed of sheet after sheet of soft, pliable material, each sheet not much thicker than tissue paper. The sheets very readily peel off so that the surface is always ragged. The handle is made out of a thin piece of cane. At each end it is passed through the folded bark and twisted back on itself. Split cane is used to bind together the bark and the handle. The second type is still rougher. It consists of thick sheet of paper bark, the two ends of which are pinched together and tied round with strips of bark, so that a kind of trough is formed. The one shown in Fig. 5 measures 16 inches in length, 7 in width and 5.5 in depth. For some reason it has attached to it one of the small spherical bags, called balduck, which the natives usually wear suspended from a string round the neck and in which they carry small personal belongings. 3. Baskets woven out of grass, rushes or split cane. These form a very distinctive series and can be divided into two main groups, one containing 3 and the other 2 types. So far as my experience goes there is wonderful uniformity in the manner of their actual manufacture, but, whilst this is so, they afford the natives more scope for the display of decorative work than any other of their ordinary implements. The names that I use are those in use in the Kakadu tribe. The first group, A, consists of those that have a neck, the mouth opening of the basket being greater in diameter than the part immediately succeeding it. The second group, B, consists of those in which there is no neck. A. Baskets with a neck. These vary much in size and amongst them 3 types may be recognized. Type 1. This is represented by the specimens figured in Plate XXI, Figures 1 and 4. It is called kurokura. The meshwork is very open. The longitudinal strands vary in different specimens. In the larger ones, such as Fig. 1, which measures 20 inches in length, they may be formed of thin pliant twigs, but in smaller ones they are made of stiff grass or rushes, called wurnia. The transverse lines are each made of 2 strands of plaited, bark fiber string, called marabanja. For inches below the open end, in Figure 1, there is a raised line made by the plaiting of 3, instead of the usual 2 strands. The margin of the opening is bounded by a circle of cane wound round with fur string and, immediately below this, are 2 other narrow circles of wood which serve to preserve the shape of the opening and are kept in place by string which can be seen passing round them and the marginal circle. The base of the basket has a very strongly marked indentation. The decoration is very simple, and consists, first, of a band of white, passing all round the neck region for a breadth of 4 inches. Below this there are 8 white lines enclosing as many longitudinal spaces. 2 of these, which are opposite to one another, and one of which can be seen on the right side of the figure, have 5 rectangular spaces of red ochre, outlined with white. On each side of these there is a yellow band and between these a red one. To one side of the opening there is attached a loop of banyan fiber string, by means of which the basket is carried. In the second specimen, Figure 4, the margin has been broken away, and there is no color decoration. I found it in the possession of a lubrak camped by the side of a lagoon at Impeli, near the East Alligator River, and, on investigating its contents, discovered that they consisted mainly of the bones of her young child, who had died a few months previously. Type 2. This is represented by the specimen figured on plate XX, figure 4. It is called Jalara. As compared with the Kuro-Kura, this and the next type are characterized by the relative closeness of the meshwork. The longitudinal strands of the Jalara are made of grass stalks, called Mugana, or Mukana. The cross bands are made of plaited, single strands of string. Sometimes the longitudinal bands are made up of 2 or 3 fibers, which look much as if a single grass stalk had been split longitudinally. Around the margin of the basket the ends of the longitudinal stalks are turned down and bound round, together with other stalks, by means of a double strand of shredded bark, to form a definite margin to the opening. The total length of the basket is 14 inches, the diameter of the opening is 7, and that of the neck 5. The decoration is very simple. There are a series of crossing and slanting yellow bands, outlined with white, that enclose a number of lozenge-shaped light red spaces. Type 3. At first sight this is very like the Jalara, but, on closer inspection, it is seen to differ very distinctly. It is represented by the specimens figured on plate XXI, figure 3, and plate XXA, figure 5. It is called Naborgo, and resembles the Jalara in having, as compared with the Kuro-Kura, a comparatively close meshwork. A typical example is shown in figure 3, plate XXII. The total length of which is 19 inches and the width of the opening 8 inches. The longitudinal strands of the Naborgo are usually made of twisted grass stalks or shredded fibers of pandanus leaves. The cross bands always differ from those of the Jalara in being composed of double strings, whereas, in the latter, each of the 2 plaited strings is a single fiber. In Fig. 3, at the base of the basket, about 14 of the longitudinal strings are gathered together, bound round with fine string and then pass up the opposite side. The other longitudinal strands are similarly bound together and pass under, and at right angles to the first series. In this specimen there is no attempt at decoration, but in figure 5, plate XXIA, there is a more or less elaborate scheme. There's series of light red bands outlined with white, enclosing dark red triangular spaces. B. Baskets without a neck. These are much more common than those of the first group, but, though very numerous, and differing very much in size, they may all, so far as these northern coastal tribes are concerned, be divided into 2 types. Type 4. In this, which is called Maliba, the meshwork is open, not nearly so much as in the Kuro-Kura, but sufficiently so as to render it unsuitable for carrying fluid material. It is represented by the specimens illustrated on plate XX figs 3 and 6, and plate Ziv, figures 1 and 2, and 7. Figure 3, plate XXA, may be taken as a typical example. It measures 17 inches in length and 5.5 in diameter. The longitudinal bars are made of 2, or more, split grass stalks, or shreds of pandanus leaves, the transverse lines by 2, plaited, single strands of string. Just as in the Jalara. Around the margin of the opening, the ends of the longitudinal bars are cut off abruptly and a strand of string is threaded in and out to form a binding. To carry the basket a loop of 4 strands of vegetable fiber string is attached to one side, which may be spoken of as the back of the basket because, here, there is left an uncolored band, 4 inches wide, running along the length of the basket. The rest of which is ornamented with bands of light red outlined with white and enclosing spaces of dark red. Figure 7, plate Ziv. Has lines of the bright-colored feathers of the blue mountain parakeet woven into the grass strands so as to outline rectangular spaces, all of which have been painted over with red ochre and most of them then crossed with lines of white. Of the 3 specimens illustrated on plate Ziv, figure 2 is interesting because of its design, to which reference is made later, and the one represented in figure 7 because of its relatively small size. It measures 8 inches by 2.25. Type 5. This is represented by the specimens illustrated in plate XXI, figures 2 and 5, plate XXI, figures 1 and 2, plate Ziv, figures 3, 4, 5, and 8. It is called Namalka, or Namalga, and its characteristic feature is the way in which the strands are so closely woven together that the basket can be used for carrying fluid material, such as honey or even water. In addition to this, the surface is always crossed by paired ridges, each one made by the weaving in of an extra strand of string. So far as shape, size, and the nature of the strands are concerned, it is similar to the Maliba, but the open meshwork of the latter and the closed one of the Namalka serve, at once, to distinguish these two types. Figure 2 on plate XXI is a good, simple example of this type. It measures 25 inches in length and 7 in diameter. A little way below the mouth a circle of blue mountain parakeet feathers has been woven into the uppermost of the cross ridges. These are arranged in pairs and are utilized in the design, which consists only of alternate bands of light and dark red ochre, the former always including, and terminating with, the ridges. As in the Maliba, so in the Namalka, the loop, which serves for carrying the strand, is woven into the strands at 2 points on what may be called the back of the basket, because here the raised ridges and the color bands are absent. The ends of the longitudinal strands of grass, rushes or pandanus leaves, used in the making of the basket, are cut off abruptly round the margin of the mouth and a strand of 2-ply string is threaded in and out, just as in the Maliba. This thread always passes through the side of the basket between the second and third transverse strands of string. Fig. 5, plate XXII, measures 18 inches in length and 8 in width. It is decorated in squares and the ridges end in a curious asymmetrical way on the back, some projecting much further than others onto the uncolored median space. The remaining specimens differ from one another mainly in regard to size and decoration, which will be referred to later. Figure 8, plate Ziv, is one of the smallest examples, measuring only 7 inches in length. Figure 3, plate Ziv. However, is somewhat interesting, in this one the shape is distinct, inasmuch as the mouth of the basket, which measures 14 inches in length, is decidedly smaller in diameter than the lower part of the basket. This may possibly be intentional, but the natives called it by the same name that they gave to the specimens represented in figures 4 and 5 and 8, plate Ziv. By some chance the maker, or, perhaps, someone at a later period, had secured a few rags of cloth which, by way of ornament, he had woven into the strands. They formed an unpleasant contrast to the circle of beautiful parakeet feathers running round a short distance below the margin. 4. Baskets made out of bark. Bark baskets are known from other parts of Australia, but those made by the natives of Melville and Bathurst Islands are remarkable both for their great size and bold designs. They are entirely different in this respect from any known elsewhere, plates XXV, XXXIV, XXXV. They are made, apparently exclusively, from the bark of one particular series of eucalyptus, known as the stringy bark gum tree, out of which, also, the natives make their bark canoes and lean-to shelters. The island name for them is Wangadonga, the second half being the word for bark. The bark can only be stripped off with ease during the wet season, and it is at this period that these baskets are made. From the point of view of design they are dealt with in the chapter on Decorative Art. 62. They are all made in a precisely similar way, however small or large they may be. An oblong piece of bark of the desired size is cut from the tree, nowadays by means of an iron tomahawk, but originally by the sharp edge of a shell or a stone axe. It is first of all carefully scraped over, to remove the outer, rough surface. Then it is bent double on itself, and the two sides sewn firmly together by means of strands of split cane. In many cases a thin coating of wax, or resin, is added, but, whether this be so or not, the edges are always so closely united that the basket will hold water. The handle is always very small, and, in many cases, appears to be quite inadequate in size and strength. It is attached to what may be described as the back of the basket, and is made sometimes out of banyan bark string, sometimes out of split cane. In either case each end of the loop passes through the bark and is knotted on the inner side. When empty it may be carried in the hand, but when full of yams, or other food, it is carried on the back by means of a stick passed through the handle. In many cases, as in figure 1 on plate XXXIV, The two sides are strengthened, near the opening, by special strands of split cane sewn across from side to side in crisscross fashion. In every basket the margin on the back is sewn over with a double strand of split cane, also in crisscross, the object evidently being to prevent the bark from splitting down, as it might easily do in this part where the pressure is greatest around the handle. The cane sewing is, also, always continued round each side, where the two edges have been originally united, and for a short distance on the front margin. These bark bags vary very much in size. Figures 1 and 2, on plate XXXV, represent specimens of, probably, maximum size at least. Amongst a great number I have never seen any larger ones, and, when full of yams, one of these is quite enough for an ordinary blackfellow to carry. The largest measures 30 inches in height and 14 from side to side, across the opening. The specimen between the two larger ones measures a foot in height, for of fair average size are shown on plate XXV, Fig. 1 measures 16 inches in height, 8 across the opening and 15 at the base. The corresponding measurements in Figure 2 are 15, 10 and a half, 13 and a half, in Figure 3 they are 16, 10 and a half, 12, in Fig. 4 they are 15, 11, 14. One of the smallest of these bark baskets is represented in Figure 4. Plate XXXIV. It measures only 8 inches in height, 5 across the mouth and 7 at the base. 5. Knitted bags. In all tribes knitted bags are met with. They vary much in size from little ones, a few inches in length, to large ones which, when flattened out, are typically broader at the base than the mouth and may measure 2 feet, or even more, across in the widest part and are carried by means of a string loop. The Kakadu people have two distinct kinds, one, called mela, in the knitting of which a knot is employed, and another, called nungulora, in which there is no knot. The favorite material for making them is string, called mukinoborbo, made out of banyan bark, though other kinds may also be used. These bags, like the baskets, are often carried by the women, suspended down their backs with the loop passing across the forehead. There is one very characteristic little bag which is worn by men only. In the Kakadu and allied tribes every man has one of these. Each is spherical, from 2 to 2.5 inches in diameter, with a loop of string, the two ends of the loop being tied round and round close to the mouth of the bag, which is thereby tightly closed. In this bag the man keeps little odds and ends, perhaps a cutting flake, or a bit of resin, or if he can secure it a little bit of tobacco. It is, if not full, padded out with paper bark and is always spherical. It is called balduck and is worn suspended from the neck, Figure 8, usually in front but sometimes in the middle of the back. The string is always long enough to allow the bag to be held in the mouth. During fights and ceremonies when the men get excited one of the first things that they do is to put the bag between their teeth and bite it hard. A man wearing it is shown in Figure 8. Spherical masses of birds down of the same size and known by the same name, are used as ornaments. One of them is carried by the Maikanyirdinga girl during the initiation ceremonies in the Melville Island tribe. Figure 7, Plate 1. Trumpets. These are identical with those that we have described before 63 and are of two types, 1, those made out of hollow branches of gum trees, ironwood, etc., and, 2, those made from bamboo. The term trumpet is, of course, a misnomer, but it is popularly applied in Australia to this native musical instrument, for which the name conch would, perhaps, more appropriate. The Australian Aboriginal has two forms of musical instruments. One consists of sticks, which he clangs together, and the other of a hollow stick or small log, through which he blows. The trumpets, or conchs, are much used during both the ordinary corroborees and the sacred ceremonies and, under ordinary circumstances, produce a monotonous booming sound, much like a continuous repetition of the words, biddle and bum, with a long, strong emphasis on the bum. The u sound being long drawn out, there is, however, very considerable variation in regard to the ability of different musicians. In the Kakadu, for example, there is one man who is notably good and will imitate wonderfully well the calls of various birds, such as the native companion. When in camp he is constantly asked to perform and the natives listen to him by the hour. Most of the music is, however, extremely monotonous, and one can often hear the trumpets booming away, till late at night, out in the scrub, where the natives are singing and dancing round their campfires. 5 typical examples are shown on plate XXV. Figure 1 is just 4 feet long and 2 inches in diameter. It is made out of a gum tree branch which has been smoothed down. Fig. 2 is very crude and unfinished, the bark still remaining on it. The twist in the branch is not a matter of importance. In fact, some of the best trumpets have a decided twist or bend, and it is surprising how much difference there is amongst them. Figure 3 is a well-made specimen, measuring 5 feet in length and tapering from a diameter of 3 inches at one end, to 1 1/4 at the mouth end, which is coated over with beeswax. The 2 remaining ones are made of bamboo, and, like all of these, are ornamented with an incised design. The latter is very simple, consisting only of a series of zigzag lines. The case of the gum tree branches, there is no difficulty in regard to the hollowing out. It is very rare, in any of the northern parts of the territory, to find any branches which are riot hollow, so that the natives can easily secure one that is suitable for a trumpet. In the bamboo, the partitions that pass across the nodes have to be removed, which can be done by means of a fire stick. As a general rule, the mouth end is coated with wax so that the lips can fit on tightly. Fire making and cooking. There are 2 methods of making fire amongst these, as, indeed, amongst many Australian tribes, in their primitive condition. The first is the drill. In the Kakadu tribe, which may be taken as representative, the fire sticks are relatively short, usually under 2 feet in length. Those illustrated in plate XXV, figure 4, vary between 18 and 22 inches. In some tribes, such as the Bimbinga, on the Gulf of Carpentaria, the lower stick is made of soft, and the upper, which is twirled upon it, of hard wood. In the Kakadu there is no distinction made, and both sticks are called ngornu. When making fire by this process, the native lays a pandanus leaf on the ground. On this he places the lower stick, which, squatting down, he holds with either one or both feet. He has previously prepared a little tinder, which consists of a little dry, shredded pandanus leaf. Then he proceeds to twirl the upper on the lower stick, using the palms of his hands for this purpose. By the side of the concavity, which is soon made in the lower stick, a small notch is cut, so that the hot, powdered wood can tumble out. The tinder is always made up into the form of a minute nest, so that the red-hot powder tumbles down right into the middle of it. During the process, one of the Kakadu natives whom I watched making fire, stopped the whirling process at a certain point when the wood was fairly warm and rubbed the warm end of the drilling stick against his nose, so as to press out onto it a little of the greasy secretion of the sebaceous glands, which the Arunta natives call urnia. He also put a very little pinch of fine sand into the hole so as to increase the friction. When the embers were smoldering, the little sphere of tinder was wrapped round in a few shreds of pandanus leaf and very carefully blown until it burst into flames. The fire sticks are always carried about, as seen in plate XXV and Fig. 4, with one of their ends wrapped up in some material, such as paper bark. In many cases a length of bamboo is used, with the closed end ornamented with a knob of resin, or wax, studded over with bright red abra seeds. A second method of fire making is by means of a sawing motion. In the Arunta the same principle is applied, but in a different way. There, a softwood shield forms the under piece, and the edge of a spear thrower, made out of hard mulga or gum tree wood, serves for the saw. In these northern parts the shield is replaced by a cleft stick, which is placed on the ground and held by the feet while another stick is run across the cleft. The hot, powdered wood falls amongst some tinder placed in the cleft. As a matter of fact, the native does not often have to make fire, because the women, when moving from camp to camp, always carry lighted fire sticks with them. So far as cooking is concerned, there are 2 main methods. The first is the simple one of cooking on the open fire in a very rough and ready way, figure 19. If, for example, they catch a flying fox, a large bat, which is a favorite and, in many parts, easily secured article of food, they first of all singe the hairs off, then dislocate the limbs, and perhaps, as I saw the Wajaman women doing in their camp on the Flora River, they will tear it up with their teeth and cook the parts separately. As a general rule, however, the body is not opened, so as to keep all the juices within. When they cook a snake, for example, they will, if they are not in a hurry, coil it round hot embers or stones, and, when it is done to their liking, they carefully make an incision in the belly wall and then, lifting each end of the snake up, apply the whole to their mouth and carefully drink all the fluid from the body cavity. A more careful and very favorite method of cooking amongst all the northern tribes consists in making an earth oven, which the Kakadu call pendi. The size of the hole varies, of course, according to the size of the food to be cooked. It is used for both yams and animal food. An average-sized pendi will be from 1 to 2 feet deep and about 2 feet in width. For yams it may not be more than a foot deep. It is dug by means of a simple, sharp-pointed digging stick or whereby. First of all a fire is made in it and a number of rounded stones placed on the fire until they are really hot. Then the fire, if anything save embers remains, is raked out, leaving the stones, upon which grass or green twigs are placed. On these the food is laid and covered with grass or twigs, or if they can get it, rankin or paper bark. Then the earth is piled over, forming a small mound, and in this pendi the food remains until they judge it to be sufficiently cooked. It is the savage precursor of the modern paper bag cookery. In many tribes, such, for example, as the Wajaman, special precautions are taken with regard to the cooking of special yams that are said to be hot. There is one, for example, called nangura, which must, first of all, cut up into slices and then put on an open fire for about a quarter of an hour. Then it is pounded up on stone and made into little cakes. 2 stones are used, a large under one called kari, and a smaller one with which the actual pounding is done, called mambura. The cakes must be placed on the fire again. Then they are made up into a big damper and put on the fire for a time, then once more the pounding process is repeated and, finally, it is again placed on the fire, after which it may be eaten. The damper itself is called chilangi. Another form of yam called magalu is treated very differently. First of all it is skinned, then it is cut into slices, placed in a basket and soaked for some hours in water. Then it is pounded on stone, made up into a damper and cooked, always in an earth oven, or pendi. These yams vary in size from small ones not much larger than a big marble to others the size and shape of large potatoes, while some are as big as Turks' heads, and others perhaps 2 feet or more in length and shaped like swollen, crooked roots. So far as food is concerned, and apart of course from special food restrictions, the natives eat everything that is edible. Their stock vegetable supplies being yams, grass seed of various kinds, which they pound up on stones and make into dampers that may be cooked in the embers of an open fire or in a pendi, and, in parts where they grow, the seeds, stem, and roots of the red lotus, fig. 74, and the ordinary lily. In places such as in Peli, where the backwaters are full of lilies, you can see the little black faces of the women just above the water all day long gathering lily tucker, which they call wurijanga. The seeds they pound up and make into a damper, which is baked on the fire, the stalks they eat raw, and the roots they cook in the open fire. Challenge sticks. In the Kakadu tribe there are certain challenge sticks, called mejanjeli, that are sent out to invite natives of other camps or tribes to take part in a fight. 2 of them are represented on plate XXV, figures 1 and 2. The upper one measures 39 inches in length, and is a solid stick with a bunch of stiff grass stalks attached at one end by means of shreds of banyan bark. The whole thing is whitened with pipe clay, and looks like a miniature broom. This form is sent out as a challenge for a general fight. The second one is smaller, and measures only 21 inches in length. It is made of reed or thin bamboo, is red ochred, and has the grass stalks bound round with banyan bark string, otherwise it is essentially like the first, and is used as a challenge to a single fight with a club called parapiriu, plate 16, fig. 4. Rasp. Amongst the possessions of a Kakadu man I came across a very simple but effective rasp, plate XXV, figure 6. I thought at first that it must be of extraneous origin, but the men assured me that it was not. They call it Imberombera. It is made of a small flat slab of wood, just a little less than a foot in length, tapering slightly towards the handle end. Starting from the broad end, a piece of stingaree, or shark skin, studded with 5 sharp denticles, was tightly stretched across one of the flat sides for a length of 7 inches. The 2 edges of the skin being sewn together on the opposite side. It certainly made a very effective implement for smoothing down the surface of a club or spear, but I have not met with it elsewhere. Spindle. In all these tribes some form of spindle is used for making hair string. Vegetable fiber string is made by twirling the fiber round on the thighs by means of the palm of the hand. There are 2 main forms of spindle. In the one which is almost always used in the center of the continent there is a central stern with 2, usually curved, pieces at right angles to one another. In the Kakadu and other tribes the one most generally used has simply a little terminal hook, which serves to hold one end of the twine while the spindle is rapidly rotated on the thigh. The hair, or fur, as the case may be, is served with the other hand. Normally the right hand is used for twirling and the left for serving. The spindle is called kopida, plate XXV, figure 5. Fan. In the coastal area practically every woman has a fan, or norkin, though these are often used by the men also. They are always made out of 2 wings of the palmate goose, a bird which is very abundant on the billabongs and backwaters. The 2 wings are always tied together with human hair string. It is a most useful implement in a country where flies by day and mosquitoes by night are often a perfect pest. No woman is without her norkin, plate XXV, figure 10. Corroboree wand. This, apparently, is only met with amongst the coastal tribes. The total length is approximately a foot and the diameter 2 inches. It is called yaila by the Kakadu and is made by tightly wrapping together strands and folds of paper bark, fig. 73, there is an outer covering of the same material which leaves one end free, as seen in the figure. This is the handle end and, during corroborees, the men squatting down strike the ground with the yaila, keeping time to the singing. It also has a quite different use, in connection, really, with magic. If a man has a pain in his back he will fasten one of these into the small of his back by means of his waist girdle. The pain, or rather evil magic causing the pain, is supposed to pass into the yaila and can then be thrown away with this. Boats. The natives on the northern coast use 2 very different kinds of boats, one of which is indigenous, the other has been derived from the Malays. The first is the bark canoe 64 which is met with all along the northern coast, on the islands, and round the shores of the Gulf of Carpentaria. This is made in parts where the natives can obtain suitable material. The first that I saw, in 1900, was at Borroloola, on the MacArthur River, near the Gulf of Carpentaria. In this 6 natives had come across to the mainland from the Palau Islands, and then more than 50 miles up the river. The water was, of course, smooth, but this is a long journey for so frail-looking a craft, and 2 of the men were kept busily at work bailing with a large shell, mellow diadema. These bark canoes are all made in essentially the same way. The material used seems to be generally, if not always, stringy bark, a species of eucalyptus, the same one that is used for the manufacture of bark baskets. The bark is cut during the wet season, when it is more easily worked and far less brittle and liable to crack than in the dry season. 65 It is trimmed down with the sharp edge of a sirena shell and cut into the required shape, the sheet is folded and the 2 ends sewn together. Sometimes only one sheet seems to be used, but at others more than one may be employed, as, for example, in the specimen first described by Mr. Gillen and myself. Along each side runs a long mangrove stem which is sewn on to the edge of the bark, and usually projects where the bark bends in to form the bow and the stern. From 4 to 6 pairs of sticks, placed crosswise in the interior of the canoe, and the same number passing across in a corresponding position from gunwale to gunwale, serve to assist in maintaining the shape of the boat and also to prevent it from collapsing. In most cases, either end serves as stern or bow, the two being identical in form, but in some, one end is curiously shaped. 66 In one that I brought back from Apsla Strait, one end was shaped very much like the tail of a shark turned upside down. It was one of 6 canoes that put out from Bathurst Island to interview Mr. Cooper and myself when we were passing through Apsla Strait in his lugger. These canoes vary in length from 12 to 15 feet, and there is no difference whatever in the essential method of construction of, on the one hand, those on Melville and Bathurst Islands and, on the other, those, far away, on the MacArthur River. Of the dugout canoes I saw 2 quite distinct types, one of which is the common one, the other is apparently a local variety. Both of them are cut out of the solid. The shape of the ordinary one can be seen in the illustration, Fig. 75, and, as said before, it seems most probable that they have been derived originally from the Malays. First of all, when one is to be made, a tall, solid tree is selected. I saw the one that they use on Melville Island, but have been unable to identify it. It is cut down, nowadays, always with an iron tomahawk, and carried to the shore or bank of a creek. Here it is trimmed into shape and hollowed out. In one which a native made for me the whole work was done by him, single-handed, with one axe. The boat is 15 feet long and 2 feet 6 inches high at both ends. Its greatest width is 2 feet and it narrows into each end, there being no difference in this respect between the bow and the stern, so that when being propelled with paddles it does not matter which end goes foremost. There is no keel of any kind, the bottom being perfectly round. In hollowing out the log, a slab, 6 inches in width and 2 in thickness, was left, running across from side to side, about a third of the way from one end. This slab has a hole in the center through which a mast can pass to be fixed into a hole in the floor of the boat. The natives are very fond of sailing, if they can secure anything that will serve as a sail, and, in this boat. The native brought himself and his lubra across from Melville Island to the mainland, a distance of 60 miles across open water during the monsoonal period. These boats are quite right in smooth water and so long as everything goes well. Mr. Cooper and myself went many miles round the southern coast and up some of the rivers in one of these dugouts, figure 75. You squat down on the floor so that all the weight is as low as possible and the gunwale is within an inch or 2 of the water if they upset. The men simply rock the boat about until the greater part of the water is shaken out and then they climb in, a very difficult business in the case of a boat without the vestige of a keel. They are, however, quite accustomed to this experience and think nothing of a capsize. There is never any attempt made to decorate the boat with carvings or design of any kind. The second form I saw only on the Daly River, but every boat there was of the same kind. In the ordinary one the 2 ends are precisely similar, but in this one end is pointed and the other is abruptly truncated, so that bow and stern ends are clearly marked. It was just as if the tree had been sawn straight across, leaving a semicircular end. There are special landing places in the mangrove scrub where these boats are drawn up and from which little tracks lead away into the scrub above water level. Along the Daly we saw 2 or 3 that are used as ferry boats and are kept at special spots where it is customary to cross the river. Chapter 13. Clothing and Ornament. Pubic tassels and aprons, waist belts, armlets, head ornaments, pendants made from birds' feathers in imitation of flowers, ornaments made of beeswax and abris seeds. The northern coastal tribes are not much troubled with clothing. Out on the central uplands and around the coasts of the Gulf of Carpentaria the nights in winter are bitterly cold, often below freezing point, and yet the natives have never learned to make fur rugs out of the skins of the kangaroos, wallabies, and possums that they can, and often do, secure in plenty. In the more northern coastal districts the climate is different and clothes are not much needed. To keep themselves warm the natives there will often use sheets of paper bark. The only things that can perhaps be strictly described as articles of clothing are the pubic tassels which are worn amongst many tribes by men and women, and the curious paper bark aprons that the women wear on Melville and Bathurst Islands. The former are often of considerable size. They consist of a large number of human hair string pendants, forming a tassel that may be a foot in length and 4 to 6 inches across. The tassel is always attached to a belt made of the same material. In the central tribes the belt consists of, perhaps, 20 strands that are only attached to each other at the two ends of the loop. In the northern tribes there are many more strands, and in addition to being thus attached, there are 2, 3, or 4 cross bands, at regular intervals, through which the strands of the belt are woven and which serve to flatten it out, so that it may have a width of 3 or 4 inches. The native is very pleased if he can secure some colored wool with which to make the cross bands. In the Kakadu, Iweji, and other northern coastal tribes bark waist belts are sometimes worn. They are made from the bark of the cypress pine and are called kupelbi. Their nature can be seen from the photographs of the 3 reproduced in Figure 71, which were obtained from natives on the South Alligator River. In the middle one the belt consists of a length of some 90 inches of bark 4 inches in width, wrapped round so as to form 3 circles. The two ends, one on the inside and one on the outside, are close together, and a circle of string is tied round in such a way that it passes between the free end on the outside and the free end on the inside. The nature of the design can be seen in the illustration. It is always drawn so that it starts close to the edge of the belt on the outside, and occupies the greater part of the outermost circle. In this example it commences at a distance of 2¼ inches from the outer end. The general color of the ground is dull red, with white bands and cross lines, leaving lozenge and crescent-shaped spaces between them. The 4 bands running across the width of the belt in the middle line in front are, however, bright red. The one on the left hand, though essentially the same, measures only 54 inches in length and has only 2 circles. The one on the right hand measures 78 inches in length and has 3 circles. A series of ornaments of various kinds is represented in Plate XXV figs. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, are ordinary armlets, made of very closely woven vegetable fiber string. Figure 1 measures 3¼ inches in width, 3 in diameter, and has 19 rows of strands. Fig. 2 is 2 inches in width, 3 in diameter, and has 14 rows. Figure 3 is 1 inch in width, and has 6 rows. Figure 4 is 3½ inches wide, has a diameter of 2¾ inches and consists of 22 strands. Fig. 5 is 2½ inches wide, 3 in diameter, and has 14 strands. The colors used in decoration are only red and white. In the Kakadu tribe these string ornaments are called murarati, and are made out of banyan bark string. In figs 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11 a distinct form of armlet is represented which is worn by almost every man and youth. It is called wimbeji, and is made out of split cane and may be very thin as in fig 10, where it only measures 1/8 of an inch, or, as in figure 8, it may be 1 3/4 inches in width and consist of many strands. In some cases, as seen in fig 11, representing a specimen from Bathurst Island, a number of plated armlets may be carried about together. In this case they are made of palm leaf, and have been gathered into 2 groups, 22 in one and 14 in the other. One end of a loop, consisting of a few strands of human hair string, is tied round each group of armlets, the free end being then attached to the main strand by means of a lump of beeswax. The special armlet represented in fig 12, called kundama, has been referred to in connection with the burial ceremonies of the Kakadu tribe. It is never colored and is always made of banyan bark string in the fashion seen in the illustration. Very characteristic forms of headdresses are seen in Plate XXV, figures 16 and 17. Each of them is composed of kangaroo incisor teeth, wax, and string. In the first there are 45 teeth, each of which is embedded in a small mass of beeswax. They are attached, side by side, by means of two double strands of string. Each single strand passes in front of and behind alternate teeth, and at each end the four strands pass out and are bound round with string so as to form a fairly strong cord, which passes behind the head. The wax is red ochred and the inner surface of the teeth is whitened. In the second specimen there are 44 teeth, which are embedded in beeswax in such a way that the whole ornament looks very much like a jaw. The teeth stand out prominently because they are whitened on both sides. The wax is black, and from each end there passes out a strand of vegetable fiber string. The whole is very pliable and can be easily adapted to the shape of the head, on which it is usually worn, with the points of the teeth hanging down. A simpler ornament, which is one of the commonest, is represented in figure 15. It is called majimbo by the Kakadu, and consists of a flattened central mass of beeswax, from 2 to 3 inches across, with kangaroo incisor teeth projecting from the more rounded part of the margin. String is fixed into the center of a smaller flattened part, and serves to tie the ornament to the hair of the head on which it is worn hanging down over the forehead. The most picturesque, or, at least, tasteful, ornaments are curious pendants made from birds' feathers. Some idea of these can be gained from those illustrated on plate XXVI. They are only made amongst these northern tribes and those on the coasts of the Gulf of Carpentaria. The ones figured were collected amongst the Kakadu tribe. In the specimen represented in Fig. 20, 2 of them are attached to an ordinary head ring, which is made of vegetable fiber. At 2 places opposite to one another, the strands are bound round with string, and the pendants are attached to this part. Each consists of the light gray feathers of a native companion, all cut down to an even length and arranged so as to resemble the petals of a flower, the stamens in the center being indicated by a little tuft of down. The stalks of the feathers are embedded in a little tapering mass of wax, from the other end of which the string passes off to attach the pendant to the head band, which is worn in such a way that a pendant hangs down over each ear. In Figs 16 and 18 white cockatoo feathers are used, and the human hair string, by which it is attached to the hair of the head, is largely enclosed in red ochred beeswax. Figure 19 is rather more ornate. The 2 pendants are attached to one another by 4 strands of vegetable fiber string. The imitation flower is made out of the bright feathers of the blue mountain parakeet and the wax is red ochred and dotted over with white. The total length of the ornament, which is worn on the head, is 12 inches. Figure 15 is made out of white feathers crossed by black bars and has a small knob of wax in the center. Shredded bark is used as string and the wax is banded with white and red. In figure 17 the dark-colored goose feathers are used, the whole pendant measuring 5.5 inches in length. Fig. 21 represents one of a pair of similar ornaments of uncommon form. It consists of the head of a blue mountain parakeet with its bright orange bill and metallic blue feathers and a few of the upper, orange-colored neck feathers. The base of the skull is attached to a short, curved wax handle by means of which it can be fastened to a lock of hair. As the eyes, tongue, and brain have been simply cut out and no preservatives used, this is more or less a temporary ornament in a moist, warm climate. On Melville and Bathurst Islands and on the northern coast the natives make very decorative ornaments out of masses of beeswax, studded over with abris seeds. A few of these are represented on plate XXVI. The abris is a leguminous plant with a pod like that of a pea. Each seed has a bright red coat except for a small black patch where it is attached, and, in most cases, this part of the seed is hidden from view. Each ornament consists of a central mass of beeswax, molded by the hand to the desired size and shape, and then the seeds are simply pressed on. Figure 11 is a sphere 2¼ inches in diameter. Fig. 12 measures 4 inches by 2 and has a strong loop of banyan bark string. Figure 13 represents one of the smaller ones, measuring 2 inches and a quarter by 1 inch. Figure 14 is rather interesting, it came from the East Alligator River. The larger part measures 3 inches by 2½ the smaller is 1¼ inches in diameter. And the ornament is evidently molded on the form of one of the little spherical bags called balduck that almost every man wears round his neck. Chapter 14. Decorative Art. Mourning armlets, rings, and discs of the Melville and Bathurst Islanders, bags and baskets, grave posts of the Melville and Bathurst Islanders, clubs and spears, sacred ceremonial objects. Decorations drawn on the bodies of men. Bark and rock drawings. There is, of course, much that is common, in regard to their decorative art, to all the tribes of Central and Northern Australia, especially in respect of the ornamentation of their commoner weapons and implements. So that much of what we have already written on this subject 67 holds true of the tribes now dealt with. On the other hand, there are certain forms of design restricted to special parts of the country and characteristic of different tribes or group of tribes. In the west of the continent we have the incised and painted zigzag pattern. In the center there is the strong development of spiral and concentric circles drawn on the ground, rocks, and sacred objects. So again, in the far north, we meet with quite a different scheme of design, the most characteristic being that of the Melville and Bathurst Islanders, whose drawings and decorations are entirely distinct from any on the mainland and suggest contact, in past time, with a people whose art was more akin to that of the islands to the northeast than it is to anything in Australia. Then again, amongst the Kakadu nation, we meet with rock and bark drawings superior to any amongst the central tribes. So far as the methods of ornamentation are concerned, we can distinguish the following. 1. Incision by means of a stone, shell, or tooth. This is best seen on some of the Murrian objects. 2. Painting the surface with pigments, those used being pipe clay, red ochre of at least two kinds, yellow ochre, and charcoal. This painting may take place on human bodies, on implements and weapons of various kinds, on sacred objects, and on rocks and bark. I did not amongst these northern tribes see any instance of painting designs on the ground. 3. Decorations with down derived from birds or plants. We can again, so far as the nature of the decorations and designs is concerned, divide them into three main groups: zoomorphs, phytomorphs, and geometrical designs. It is quite possible that, amongst the latter, not a few may be the derivatives of one or other of the first two, and it is interesting to note, amongst the sacred Murrian objects of the Kakadu tribe, some which have been distinctly designed in imitation of the form of an animal, others which faintly suggest an animal or plant, and others which are purely symbolic. In describing them I will, as before, deal with them under the headings of the various implements, weapons, ceremonial objects, etc., with which they are concerned. From this point of view they can conveniently be divided into the following groups: 1. Mourning armlets, rings, and discs of the Melville Islanders; 2. Bags and baskets; 3. Grave posts of the Melville and Bathurst Islanders; 4. Clubs and spears; 5. Sacred ceremonial objects; 6. Decorations drawn on the bodies of men; 7. Bark and rock drawings. 1. Mourning armlets, rings, and discs of the Melville and Bathurst Islanders. The first time that I saw these was in connection with the mourning ceremonies on Melville Island, in July, 1911. In March, 1912, and again in December of the same year, I saw them both on Melville and Bathurst Islands. 68 They are quite unlike anything known on the mainland and, so far as my experience goes, are only used together with curious, flat, almost quoit-like rings, during the dances that take place in connection with the burial and mourning ceremonies. They are most distinctive structures and it is very rare to find two that are alike in form and decoration. Those figured on plates 8, 6, and XXX have been selected out of a considerable number and from a fairly representative series. Each one consists essentially of a sheet of bark, derived from the stringy bark gum tree. This is cut into various shapes, according to the design decided upon, and is then folded on itself in one of two ways, giving rise to two main types of armlets. Of these, one may be described as the single dash, and the other as the double fold armlet. Of the single fold we may take as an example figure 2 on plate XXX. The original sheet of bark was shaped as in the accompanying sketch, diagram I, p. 410, and has approximately the following dimensions. Diagrams 1, 2, and 3 represent the original form of the sheets of bark out of which 3 armlets have been made. The total length was 28 inches. The width at each end was 4 inches and, at a distance of 5 inches from each end, it gradually swelled out, reaching a maximum of 8 inches in the middle, along the line CD. A piece, approximately 2 inches square, was cut out of each end and then the whole sheet was bent over so that the two ends came together, meeting along the lines EF and enclosing an open space for the arm to pass through. 8 inches in length and 3 in greatest width. Where the edges of the two square ends came together they were sewn round with split cane which was continued all round the free margin on both sides. A light-colored stick with knobs of beeswax, ornamented with red abra seeds, was passed through the upper angle of the armlet space and kept in place by human hair string, strands of which were bound round the open square, some of them passing on either side, below the cross stick. Split feathers of white cockatoo and brown owl were fastened between the square ends, the only other decoration consisting of a circle of wax on each side covered with abra seed. This was one of the very few examples in which the surface of the bark was left in its natural state, no color design of any kind being drawn on it. Of the double-fold type we can take 2 examples, one a simple and the other a more complicated one. The first is the one represented on Plate 6, Figure 3. The central oblong measured 7 inches in length and 8 in width, Diagram 2. At each end there was a projecting slip 8 inches long and 2 broad. The first fold was along the central line AB, the second along the line CD, so that when the armlet was formed it had a single projection at one side. The bark was sewn together with split cane along the top line and round the 2 free edges on the left-hand side in the figure. The 2 projecting pieces were bound round with fir string and, while the bark was pliant, were shaped so that they formed a kind of spout, which was smeared over with beeswax and white pipe clay. At the free end there was a lump of wax with abra seeds, and the same were also fixed into wax round the proximal end and along the upper line of the armlet. The whole surface was decorated with a central band consisting of red spaces outlined with yellow. On either side of this was a broader band of white crossed by slanting lines of red. As a second example of the double-fold type we may take the more complicated one represented in Plate XXX, Figure 4. The shape of the original piece of bark was as indicated in Diagram 3. The total length was approximately 24 inches. At each end was a projecting piece 4 inches broad and 5 inches long. The central piece measured 14 inches in length by 8 in width. In each projecting end piece a square was cut out, and in the main central part 4 oblongs were cut out, each measuring 4 inches in length by 1.5 in width. In such a position that when the bark was folded over along the line AB the 2 upper and the 2 lower ones, respectively, coincided in position, and when, again, the sheet was folded along the line CD there were 2 window-like openings formed, one on each side of the armlet. The free edges of the upper part of the main body of the armlet, and of the openings, were sewn round with split cane. Where the 2 halves of the bark came together, on the upper side of the armlet, there was a thick coating of beeswax daubed over with pipe clay, and below this many strands of vegetable fiber string were wound round and round. The projecting upper part was bound round partly with split cane, partly with string, and a stick, fastened between the 2 original halves, ran across from side to side, its ends decorated with tufts of split cockatoo feathers. A characteristic feature of this particular armlet was the presence of 2 rings A-flat 4 inches in diameter, fixed at the very end, and around 5 inches in diameter, at the base of the projecting piece. From the upper of these a strand of human hair string, carrying a bunch of feathers, hung down on each side. The color decorations were very characteristic. Above the window was a red circle with yellow dots, below it a black band outlined with white and bearing white dots. On each side of the circle was a white space, one covered with red, the other with yellow cross lines. Then came a cross band, yellow on the left of the window, black on the right. The spaces by the side of the window were white, with red cross lines on the right and yellow on the left. Then came a yellow band on the right and a black on the left, and below this again white spaces with red cross lines on the left and yellow on the right. Each of the spaces and bands was outlined either with yellow or white, and throughout the whole scheme the colors alternated on the two sides. Figures 1 and 2 and 4, on plate 6, are representatives of single-fold armlets. In two of them there is only one projecting piece, the end of which in each case is tipped with beeswax and ornamented with birds' feathers and abris seeds. In the third specimen, Fig. 4, there are 4 projections, each approximately 3 inches in height. The main body of the armlet is 10 inches in width and the same in depth. The free edges of the bark are everywhere sewn round with split cane, and 2 bands of vegetable fiber string assist in binding together and strengthening the projecting pieces, 2 of which carry tufts of feathers. There are 6 series of bands running in a slanting direction from above downwards, 3 in one direction and 3 in the other. The 2 sets cross one another and produce a series of lozenge-shaped spaces. The general ground color is dull yellow ochre, the bands are all outlined in white, some of the spaces are filled with white lines, crossed by yellow, and others with spots of yellow and white. The projections and sewn upper edge are daubed over with white. Figure 1 on plate XXX shows a somewhat different type. It is an example of the double-fold type. Apparently there were 4 small projecting pieces left in the bark, 2 at each end. These are brought together by the folding and bound round with string. Bent pieces of split cane are inserted in the projections so as to form a structure shaped like a basket handle, 8 inches high. A strong strand of string crosses over from one side to the other in a slanting direction, and a considerable amount of beeswax covers the lower part of the handle. The main armlet is 7 inches wide and 7 deep, and the greatest width of the opening is 4 inches. The upper line of the armlet, where the 2 edges are sewn together, is encased in beeswax, which is colored black, and affords a strong contrast to a whitened band of banyan string that runs round immediately below it. The color decoration consists of red, white, and yellow bands. The white bands are crossed by dark lines due to the white having been scratched off with a stick while it was wet so that the dark bark shows through. Fig. 3 is an example of a small double-fold specimen. The total height to the top of the knob is 10 inches, the internal space of the armlet measuring only 4 inches by 2. The projecting portion was similar in form to that in Fig. 2, but the bark has been completely hidden from view, partly by string and partly by beeswax. The string has smeared over with wax and then whitened. From the upper crossbar a knob projects, and this, together with the crossbar, is a mass of bright red abris seeds. The general surface of the bark has been colored a dull red. White lines have been drawn across this and then red ones again, crossing the white. Other forms are represented on plate 8, from which a good general idea of the color scheme and decoration of these armlets can be gained. The 2 lower ones, figures 1 and 2, are amongst the most ornate, and it is possible that the string ornaments have been suggested by the rigging of a ship. The brown feathers are those of the Nankin night heron. Fig. 3 is a curious type with a handle-shaped structure from which sharp-pointed sticks and red ochred hair pendants hang down. In all cases the lines of red and yellow pigment cross the white ones. In Fig. 3 it will be noticed that there is a curious asymmetry in the structure of the ornamentation formed by the 2 whitened sticks. It is impossible to say what they represent. In addition to the armlets, the women carry, during the burial and mourning ceremonies, on Melville and Bathurst Islands, curious but very decorative objects, some of which are flat discs, others like these with the center cut out. In essential form the latter are similar to the armlets, in fact, as can be seen in the various objects figured on plates 9, XXXI, XXXII, and XXXI. There is a complete gradation in size between the large ceremonial disc, called Bamagun, measuring 15 inches in diameter, shown on plate XXXI, and the child's armlet, plate XXXI Fig. 5, in which the central opening measures only 1.5 inches. The large disc represented on plate XXXI. Was carried by a woman during the last series of mourning ceremonies that I saw on Bathurst Island in December, 1912. The disc itself is made of 6 circles of bent cane, each wrapped round with split cane. The inner and outer margins of the disc are set round with interlaced pieces of split cane, as is well shown in Plate 9, Figure 3. A certain amount of human hair, or sometimes banyan fiber string, is used to bind together the various circles, and then the whole surface is covered with a layer of beeswax. In this particular instance the disc has a total diameter of 15 inches, the central space measuring 9 inches. The color decoration is very distinctive. On the upper part of the circle, on the inner side, there is a white area edged with yellow above, and to the outside of this there is first a black and the area on the margin. The two being separated by a white line which has been a good deal rubbed out. Following down each side, there is a red area separated by a white line from a yellow space on the margin of the outer side, then there follows a black band running across from the outer to the inner margin. Then a broad white band edged with a narrow yellow line on the upper and a red on the lower side, and, lastly, in the middle, lower part a broad yellow band. To the margin of this lower part there is attached a stout, median strand of banyan fiber string and, on either side of this, a loop of the same, from each of which 2 strands hang down. The parts of the string strands close to the disc are coated with beeswax, thickly studded with bright abrus seeds. Each of the 5 pendant strands ends in a rounded mass of wax covered with seeds, the central one, in addition, being ornamented with a tuft of owl's feathers. The total length of the object was just 30 inches and, when in use, was carried by a woman who held it up in her right hand so that the strands of string hung pendant. The specimens illustrated on Plate XXXAI were also used during the same burial ceremony as the one last described. The one represented in Figure 1 is called Pella Pella and is made of a series of rings of split cane, joined together and coated over with beeswax. The disc measures 8 inches in diameter, the central area of 3 inches being occupied by abrus seeds. Around these is a white ring crossed by yellow lines and, on the outer margin, are 4 areas with the same colors, the remainder of the surface of the disc being red ochred. At the lower end, when it is held upright in the hand during the mourning ceremony, is a mass of beeswax with abrus seeds, and hanging down from this a strand of banyan bark string. The first 5 inches is whitened, then comes a small mass of wax and abrus seeds, this is followed by 11 inches of red ochred string and more wax and seeds, and this again by 5 inches of whitened string and a terminal lump of wax and seeds. Figure 2 is simply another bamagun, made of 7 concentric rings with a total diameter of 13 inches and a half. The design on the disc itself is exactly the same as that on the larger one already described, but in this case there is only one single pendant which takes the form of a strand of banyan bark string, just 12 inches long. At its upper and lower end, it passes through a small disc, each made of split cane, bound round with human hair string and colored with black, yellow and red bands. Immediately beneath the lower disc it ends in a knob of wax covered with abrus seeds. Figure 3 is a small bamagun, made of 5 circles of split cane. The innermost is bound with split cane, the next one the same. The third has human hair, the fourth has shredded bark and the fifth and outermost one is bound with fine split cane arranged in crisscross fashion. A certain amount of wax has been added, but not nearly enough to cover the surface, which is ornamented with 2 patches of white pipe clay, the rest is red ochred and there are a few clumps of abrus seeds set in the wax. The objects represented on Plate XXXAI are, some of them, used during mourning ceremonies, others are ordinary armlets. They show, taken in conjunction with those figured on Plates 9, XXXI, and XXXII. The transition from the ordinary armlet, Plate XXXI, figures 7 and 8 and 9, to the highly elaborate and ornate disc, which is far too large to be worn on the arm and which, as a matter of fact, is always carried in the hand. Each of them consists of the usual circles of split cane bound round with cane and hair string, with ornamental pendants of different kinds. The most elaborate ones are those represented in figures 4 and 5, Plate XXXII. In the first of these the disc measures 5 inches across and has a human hair pendant more than a foot in length, the upper part has the form of a loop. The two halves of which are largely covered with beeswax, and there is also a short crosspiece, between the loop and the main disc, that serves to carry bunches of feathers. The two halves of the loop unite to form the main pendant, which is surrounded, at its free end, with a ring of wax and terminates in a bunch of feathers. Figure 5 is a child's armlet, called bellu bellu. It is covered all over with thick fir string and ornamented with abris seeds and 3 pendant strands of fir string, each terminating in a knob of beeswax. Figures 7 and 9 represent the ordinary armlets that are in everyday use. The whole color scheme and design of these armlets, discs, and rings, as shown in plates 8 and 9, is quite distinct from anything met with on the continent. 2. Bags and baskets. Amongst the objects which lend themselves most to the display of decorative art are various forms of baskets. There are 3 main types: woven, leaf, and bark baskets. Amongst the woven baskets there is practically an endless series of designs, some idea of which may be obtained from the illustrations on plates XXI, XEI, and ZIV. In the case of the more open-netted forms the design is limited to lines and bands. One of the simplest of these is seen in plate XXI, figure 1, in which the network is very open. Down the back is a broad band of red outlined with white, on the outer side of which is a band of yellow. The central line in front has a series of red squares outlined with white. On plate XXI, figures 3 and 4 and 5, we have very simple designs. Around the center of one bag, figure 3, run 4 bands, 2 of light and 2 of dark red, outlined with white. Other bands of the same colors run from these either lengthwise or crosswise, leaving between them uncolored triangular spaces. The decoration in the more closely woven baskets varies to a large extent. The spacing of the design is largely governed by the presence of distinct transversely running ridges. In its simplest form it is seen in the basket in plate XXI, fig. 2, in which there are a series of light and dark red circles, the light red ones always including the ridges. A little way below the margin there is a circle of blue mountain parakeet feathers. A slightly more elaborate design is shown in plate XXI, figure 6, in which the circles are broken up into oblongs by longitudinal lines, some of the spaces being colored red while others are crossed with white lines. All of them are outlined with parakeet feathers. In the specimen on plate ZIV, figure 3, there is a further variation. Around the margin there is a circle with a special design of V-shaped lines, the apexes of which are cut through by a white circle. Below this we have a band of dark red and then 4 other bands, 2 of red and 2 covered with cross-hatched white lines. The very apex of the basket is dark red with which also all the bands are outlined. Along the length of the basket run lines decorated with odd shreds of red material that the maker had picked up somewhere and which, being white man's material, he used instead of his own native feathers, probably thinking that he had, thereby, enhanced considerably the value of his work. In plate XXI, figure 5, the ridges are used, in the same way, to accentuate the design. The 2 upper spaces in front are dark red, then follow 2 with white cross lines, then 2 black, then 2 dark red, 2 with white cross lines. Then red spaces with slanting lines of white as in the circle round the margin, the apex being dark red. The 4 dark red squares in the front have white circles and all the transverse and longitudinal lines are light red, the whole design being very effective, as is also the one on the basket shown in plate ZIV, figure 4. On some of these baskets the human figure is introduced into the design. It is always conventionalized, but in all cases the drawing is remarkable because it shows how clearly they have recognized the equivalence, anatomically, of the fore and hind limbs and the fact that, just as in other mammals, the elbow normally points backwards and the knee forwards. As a general rule the sexes are clearly indicated by the fact that on those intended for women the breasts are indicated by lines. For example, the basket shown in figure 2 on plate ZIV has a dark red oblong in the center with the figure of a man. This oblong, outlined with white, lies in the middle of a light red band running along the length of the basket, on which, one above and one below, two women are clearly indicated. In Figure 6 the man and woman are placed side by side. The palm leaf baskets are not often decorated, which may perhaps be due to the fact that they are of a less permanent nature than the others. In Figure 2 on Plate XXI, one of the few decorated ones that I met with is represented. The design is very simple, consisting only of circular patches of red outlined with white. The rest of the palm leaf surface is uncolored. Again, in Fig. 6, the surface of the leaf has been daubed over very roughly with red, yellow, and white and, by way of extra decoration, a dogtail ornament has been attached by hairstring to one side of the basket. It is amongst the bark baskets of the Melville and Bathurst Islanders, however, that we meet with the most striking and original decorative schemes. Some of these are represented in plates XXV, XXXIV, and XXXV. There is a most extraordinary variety amongst them and, not only this, but the two sides, in very many cases, are quite distinct from one another. In most cases the design is purely conventional, zoomorphs or phytomorphs being very rarely met with. In some, as in the one figured in Plate XXXIV, Figure 1, the design is simple and bold. The total height is 29 inches. The longitudinal white bands run into a circular one round the margin, so that the red bands, edged with yellow, do not reach the margin. The split cane sewing is very strong on either side, and is emphasized by being painted white. Fig. 2 shows an entirely different design. The whole surface has, originally, been covered with red ochre. On this, sinuous bands of yellow have been drawn. In the lower half these run roughly parallel to, but distinct from, one another. From the lowest row bands pass off, as seen in the figure, and run round the bottom of the basket to communicate in just the same way with the lowest band on the opposite side. In the upper half, the sinuous bands are arranged so that the upward curve of one corresponds in position with the downward part of the one immediately above it. The apexes of the curves are made to run into one another. A very distinctive effect is produced by outlining the bands with white spots. Figure 3 is more ornate. The design is quite symmetrical and is repeated, with very slight variations, on the opposite side. A very effective feature is the series of black circular patches, surrounded with white dots on a red band. It also shows one point which is often noticeable in these decorations. On both the white and yellow bands a succession of fine lines, running in a slanting direction, have been scratched out. The natives are very fond of this, the idea evidently being to make the band look less solid and heavy. The effect that it has can be well seen by comparing Figure 1 and Figure 3 on both Plate XXXIV and XXXV. In Figure 4, Plate XXXIV, the decoration is as simple as possible. The whole surface has been covered with a dull red and, then, on each side a simple white rectangle has been drawn. In Figure 1, on Plate XXXV, a particularly bold design is seen. The designs of the two sides are quite distinct. The design is formed of circles and bands of red, white, and yellow, with intervening spaces crossed by white lines. The yellow bands are outlined with red, the red with yellow. The design on each side is framed, as it were, with a broad band of white all round. Figure 2 shows one of the most roughly drawn designs. On the plain, uncolored bark, bands of white cross one another and are margined with yellow on one side and red on the other. In some, but by no means all, of the interspaces, roughly circular patches of red are drawn, surrounded by white. The design of Fig. 3 is very symmetrical, but differs on the two sides. The whole surface has been red ochred. On the side shown in the illustration there are 6 bands. 2 white ones running parallel to one another in the center and, on each side of these, a white and a yellow, that cross one another. The 2 central bands are bordered with yellow on their inner and red on their outer sides. The slanting white band is bordered with red on its inner and yellow on its outer side, the yellow band has white on its inner and red on its outer side. Right in the center there is a red space crossed by two white lines. The interspaces have all a red ground. Some of them have a simple series of horizontal white bars across them. Others have slanting lines of red, drawn over lines of white. The long bands have all been scratched over. The one figured in plate XXV, figure 1, shows a slight asymmetry in the design. There is a central band of yellow with white lines running down it in a zigzag way. On either side of this is a red band, then a white one, followed by a broader red one, crossed by festoons of white dots, then comes another white band, but outside this the design varies on the two sides. On the right is a red band with two lines of white dots, on the left is a simple white band succeeded by a red. The margin has a white band with two rows of black spots. Fig. 2 represents one of the rare ones, in which zoomorphs are introduced. In this case they take the form of three crude, conventional representations of human beings. The design is in the form of yellow, curved bands, outlined with white dots, looking rather like ribs projecting from a central line of vertebrae. The general surface is dull red, and the design on each side is enclosed in a white margin. Fig. 3 is a remarkable, quite asymmetrical and apparently quite meaningless, crude design. The general surface is a dull red. The lower part is coated with pipe clay, with lines roughly and irregularly scored across it. A white band passes part of the way round the margin and is connected, at one end, to another running down to the lower white patch. It is also marked with two lines of slanting incisions. The last one shows a very symmetrical design, Fig. 4, with bands of white and yellow. The white surface was originally red ochred. In the central band white spots are painted on a black background. Then follows a white band with incised lines. Then the red ground with slanting yellow lines crossing white ones, then a yellow band with incised lines, then a black band with white spots, then a white band with incised lines, then another band of slanting yellow lines crossing white ones. Then a yellow band with incised lines and, finally, the split cane that sews the edges of the bark together is colored yellow. In addition to this each band is outlined with a line of color, the succession of colors starting from one side of the central area with black spots, being as follows. Yellow, yellow, white, white, yellow, white, 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 with the sewn margin yellow. Grave posts on Melville and Bathurst Island. I have already referred to these in connection with the subject of burial and mourning ceremonies. Their arrangement round the grave is seen in figure 51, where there are two old graves side by side. The decorations of the posts could be distinguished in the case of the more recent of the two, and three of these are drawn in plate X. Facing page 232, just as they were renewed by the natives. The fourth, figure 2, is from the older grave, and only faint impressions of a design can be detected. A bush fire, also, has evidently swept over it. The nature of the designs can be seen in the figures, that in figure 1 being very simple. These four examples serve also to give a very good idea of the characteristic forms of the posts. Almost every grave has at least one shape like that in fig. 2 and another like that in figure 3. In figure 2 the projecting pieces are rod-like in form. In figure 3 the pieces supporting the top are slab-shaped. The total height of the post represented in figure 2 is 9 feet 7 inches. But the tallest one seen in figure 50 measures nearly 14 feet. The designs, so far as can be told, have no significance whatever, and may be drawn by any man, or even boy, each individual appearing to follow his own fancy. Clubs and spears. Plate XXXVI serves to give some idea of the really extraordinary and varied decorations on the Melville Island clubs and spears. Much as they vary in detail, they may really be divided so far as decoration is concerned into three main groups. First, those in which the surface is blackened, plate XXXV, figures 5 and 7, and a design of lines, circles, and dots drawn on this. Second, those in which the surface is not blackened, and the design takes the form of a successive series of color bands, third, those in which the colors alternate from side to side. The first is really a very well-marked series, of which an excellent example is shown in plate XXXV, figure 5. Along the middle of the shaft runs a series of narrow, elongated, oval-shaped patches colored alternately white and yellow. Each barb is a work of art in itself. In the first place they are cut with perfect symmetry, the space between the barb and the shaft being so narrow as to make it a matter of wonder how it is incised with the shell, Serena, sp. that they use for the purpose, to take one barb as an example, the third from the end. The tip is yellow, then a red section crossed by white lines, then yellow spots on black, then white circles on black. Then a white spot on black, then yellow lines on black, then white lines on black, then yellow spots on black, then red lines on black, then white spots on black, then white lines on black, then a red patch, and, lastly, yellow spots on black. All these different sections are painted on the one barb, and the decorations pass all round, on the side of the barb facing the shaft. In this particular spear, the shaft expands just beyond the barbs to form a somewhat flattened projecting piece, which is clearly reminiscent of the swollen hafting of many spears in which the barbed part is made out of a separate piece, and must be hafted on to the main shaft. This is ornamented with beeswax and abris seeds. This type of ornamentation is quite distinct from any other either in the island or mainland tribes, and is much less commonly met with than the second or third types, mainly, doubtless, because it takes an immense amount of time to execute. The second type is simple. It is seen in its simplest form in the specimen clubs on plate 17. Figure 10, where there is one band, is the very simplest. In Fig. 5 the lines in the second band are drawn so as to aid in suggesting the presence of deeply cut barbs, faint traces of which are seen on the margin of the club. The scheme is well shown in figure 1 on plate 19. And again in the spear represented in plate XXXVA, figure 6. The colors used are generally red and white, with sometimes, but more rarely, yellow. In this spear, which is 10 feet 10 inches long, the tip is red, then follows a white circle, a yellow and a red band. Then follows, in succession, 8 inches of white, 4 of red, 7 of white, 5 of yellow, 8.5 of white, 3 of yellow and 1 of red. In this spear, also, the part corresponding to the hafting is much emphasized. It is swollen and flattened out with 2 holes pierced through it, each ringed in red. Behind them is a mass of beeswax wound round with whitened banyan bark string. The whole of the shaft is grooved by a cutting stone. In some cases a chipped flake has been used to trim the spear, in which instance the whole surface is grooved, in others, and they form the majority, the shell is used and then the surface is often as smooth as if it had been cut with a knife. The same design is well seen in the spears with a single line of barbs in plate 14. The third scheme of decoration is the most characteristic and is, so far as I am aware, peculiar to these island tribes. It is certainly not met with amongst the northern mainland tribes. Its striking feature is an alternation of colors on the 2 sides. It is well shown in its simplest form in the spears seen in plate XXXV, figures 2 and 3, 4 and 8. In each of these there is a central line of red all the way along between the barbs, alternate sections of which are colored white on one side and yellow on the other side of the shaft, the colors alternating on the 2 sides also. In Figs 2 and 8 narrow, and in figure 3 broad, bands of red separate the white and yellow sections. As all the colors go straight across, it follows that one particular barb may be red, white, and yellow in different parts as, for example, in the 5th barb from the lower end in figure 2. A curious example of this asymmetrical color design is seen in plate 13, figure 4, in which one prong is white with red bands and the other red with white bands, both prongs ending in a red point. The best examples of this alternating scheme of decoration are, however, to be found on some of the remarkable, almost grotesque, clubs represented on plate 19. As a typical example I have chosen a part of the club represented in figure 8. This is seen in colors in plate XXXVA, Figure 1. The color scheme is very characteristic with cross lines of yellow, red, and white. In addition to the color, there are a series of lozenge-shaped areas along the margin, marked with incised lines that are clearly meant to suggest barbs. 5. Sacred ceremonial objects. Amongst the most decorative objects in these northern tribes are those associated with the Murayan ceremony in the Kakadu tribe. Those represented on Plate 3 will serve to give a good idea of the form of decoration employed. It must be remembered that each one of them is associated with a totemic animal or plant, just as in the Arunta, the Chiringa, and other objects such as Waningas and Nirtunjas are. In the case of the latter, there is no attempt to represent the animal or plant, but amongst these Murayan objects there is occasionally an attempt made to depict the object. Possibly in times past the resemblance was greater, and more general, than it is now. In Plate 3, Figure 1 represents a fish. It is just, perhaps, sufficiently reminiscent of the general form of one to suggest the animal. Fig. 2 is a native companion, the Australian crane. The two projecting points are evidently intended to represent the beak. In both of these the general body ground is yellow, bands of which are left crossing from side to side. The spaces between these are filled with fine, cross-hatched, white lines. The Melville and Bathurst Islanders use cross lines for decorative purposes, but they are very crude and coarse as compared with those drawn by the Kakadu. Also, in the former, the crossing lines are always of different colors. The lines are so close that only a very little bit of the background shows through, producing a very pleasing and characteristic effect. The great majority of these objects are red ochre to begin with, and the nature of the design can be seen in the plate. Fig. 3 represents a turtle, the flat, expanded and slightly concavo-convex slab which forms the body being ornamented in the same way on both sides. The head and tail are quite distinct, but the limbs, which are represented in some of the specimens, figures 1 and 2 and 3, Plate 4, have disappeared in this. The remaining specimens represent yams. Fig. 5 is just slightly suggestive of one attached to a root, but the others have no resemblance whatever to them. In Figure 7 the crosshatched design is varied by leaving bands where there is only one set of lines. These objects are repainted each time they are used, and, apparently, the design is handed down, though, with a successive series of artists, it must vary to a certain extent. In 3 or 4 of them, such as the one represented in Fig. 4, the feathers of the blue mountain parakeet, woven into string, are used to decorate them. Somewhat the same scheme of decoration, with crosshatched lines, is seen on the clubs used by the Kakadu and allied tribes, Plate 15. During the special ceremony, when the Murayan objects were being shown, some of the men painted, very roughly, designs on their bodies which were associated with one or other of the totems. Some of these are shown in Figure 76. A represents a kujalinga, or turtle, and bears some resemblance to the animal, which has, however, lost its hind legs. B represents, better still, the same animal. C is the egg of a crocodile. D is a jimidaupa, a small fish, to which it bears no resemblance, but it is somewhat like one of the sacred Murayan sticks associated with this animal. The two side pieces evidently represent strings with feather ornaments at their free ends. E is a special yam called chunara, and was painted right down the middle of a man's back, the sinuous band terminating on the left shoulder. F is a turkey, Eupodotus, and G an emu egg. 6. Decorations drawn on the bodies of men. The decorations on the bodies of the men during ceremonies are nothing like so elaborate as amongst, for example, the Arunta, Kadish, and Warramunga tribes. Bird's down is used to a certain extent. But it is quite common to find the design drawn in pigment. Indeed, on Melville and Bathurst Islands down is very rarely used. Simple designs in connection with sacred ceremonies are seen in Figures 42 and 46 in which the painted men belong to a fish totem, the design being supposed to represent fish bones. Those with bunches of white cockatoo feathers are kangaroo men. In the more southern tribes blood, to use as gum with which to affix the down, is drawn from a vein either in the arm or in the penis. In the Kakadu they cut a vein in the back of the hand. Amongst the Kakadu I met with curious designs drawn on the bodies of men performing an ordinary corroboree. We were watching one of the sacred Murayan ceremonies of the Kulangletchi tribe, out in the scrub near Impeli on the East Alligator River, when some of the men of the Kakadu, Omoriu, and Gaimbio tribe came up. They had just been performing an ordinary corroboree in their camp, and some of them had their bodies decorated with quaint irregular designs, drawn in white pipe clay, a few of which are represented in figure 77. They were quite irregularly arranged over the back, chest, and arms, represents yams drawn on the body of a Kakadu man. The lines on the top left-hand one are leaves, those radiating from the others are roots. The long bifid line in the lower right drawing on the body is a flower stalk, and the dots on the arms are bees. In B, the oblong in the middle of the back is a honey bag, called jailba, inside the tree. The line on top with a swollen end is the entrance and the passage down to the bag, the dots around are the bees outside the nest. Another sugar bag is drawn on the arm with some bees inside and some outside. They were drawn on the body of a Omoriu man. In C, the three upper drawings represent sugar bags drawn on the body of an Iwaja man. Of the three lower ones, the left is a yam, the central is a black fellow. And the right is only a mark and means nothing. The decorations of the Melville Island men, like those of their weapons, are very distinctive. Sometimes, but only very rarely, bird's down is used. The only occasion on which I saw it used was during the initiation yam ceremony, Fig. 29, when most of the men, at one special stage, had the upper part of their bodies thickly covered with down so that they looked very much as if they were wearing fur tippets. Each man had a thick, white line of pipe clay running down the middle of his abdomen to the pubic region. In connection with other ceremonies they used only pigments, sometimes with the most weird and grotesque results. Lines of white are often added round the eyes and over the bridge of the nose, figure 78a. In the simplest forms of design the whole body was covered over with pipe clay, bright red ochre, yellow ochre, or charcoal, one color only being used and the whole body covered from head to foot. In others the upper part of the body would be colored with red or yellow, the lower half of the face yellow, if the body were red, the upper half red or vice versa, according to the color of the body. Sometimes the upper part of the body, sometimes the whole of it was decorated with alternate lines, longitudinal or transverse, of black and red or black and yellow. A very characteristic design in the yam ceremonies consisted of sinuous lines of white and yellow, alternating on the two sides of the body, the general surface of which was sometimes uncolored, sometimes colored all over with red, figure 78b. In the most elaborate decorations of the head, the hair is often included. This I have never seen on the mainland. In the simpler designs it may be colored, wholly, white, red, or yellow, but when a man desires to be very prominent, he will decorate himself elaborately with a very definite design, figure 78, C and D. 7. Bark and rock drawings. In the Kakadu, Omoriu, Gaimbio, Iwaji and other tribes excellent rock and bark drawings are met with. There is a great deal of difference in the capacity of various men in this respect, some of them being much better than others. Up on the hill sides, among the rocks, wherever there is an overhanging shelter where the native can screen himself from the sun and rain, these drawings are certain to be found in the country of the Kakadu. The accompanying illustrations, figs. 79 to -92, will serve to give some idea of their nature. The colors used are red, white, black, and yellow. They represent the animals with which the natives come in contact, and also their ideas in regard to the nature of certain mythical and mischievous spirits. So far as the animals are concerned, it is interesting to notice that the drawings are always more or less anatomical, that is, they represent not only the external form, but, to a certain extent, the internal structure. The backbone is almost always represented, as are also the heart and main features of the alimentary canal. Even in side view, as a general rule, both eyes are drawn, the animal has two eyes and so they must be shown. In the case of mythical beings, or mormo, no such delineation of internal, anatomical details is attempted, because, perhaps, the native does not associate with them such mere animal traits. But it will be noticed that in all cases the sex is unmistakable. They are evidently drawn to represent the external features which are associated with them in the native mind. The drawings represented in Figs. 79 to -92 will serve to give a very fair idea of these bark drawings, which are amongst the most highly developed and interesting of any made by Australian Aboriginals. Fig. 79, which is 4 feet 6 inches in height, represents a special mormo called Ingwillan. There are supposed to be plenty of them living in the Delborgi, or caves, amongst the ranges. They are tall and thin, with plenty of hair on their heads. Each one carries in his right hand a kajamango or club and in his left a bunch of feathers called nieru. These Ingwillan are supposed to visit the tree grave, or workera, in which a dead native is buried. They put their hands on the dead man, talk to him, and try to make him get up, but cannot do so. Then they make corroborees, and when they go away, other spirits called Normanata come to see the body and they also make corroborees. The explanation of the kajamango is that, sometimes, a mischievous spirit from another locality may come to visit the body, in which case the friendly Ingwillan drives him away with his club. These Ingwillan only move about at night time, when they can be heard making a noise that sounds like brr. Brr. The medicine men can see them but no one else. In Fig. 82 very interesting drawings are seen. The one on the left hand is called Nanjantane, and is a spirit associated especially with the Gaimbio tribe. This is one of those mischievous individuals who, every now and then, leaves his own country and visits the Kakadu and other neighboring tribes. He looks out for boys and young men and, if he finds one alone in the bush, tries to lure him away and take his iweyu, or spirit part, from him. The only way in which the iweyu can be recovered is by the aid of a medicine man, who, carrying a numeragi snake under his arm, follows up the Nanjantane. When he finds the latter, he shows him the numeragi, which so frightens the mischievous spirit that he hands over the iweyu to the medicine man, who then hurries back to camp, carrying it in his hands, of course unseen by ordinary men, and replaces it in the body of the boy. In the figure, the double projection from the back of the Nanjantane's head represents 2 very long ears, or kudi. When he shakes these he makes a strong, rushing wind. Both eyes are drawn and 2 sharply projecting jaws. Then follows the neck, which is succeeded by 2 spaces, supposed to represent the moeru, or shoulder region. From the front of this the 2 arms project and, from the back, 2 outgrowths that are supposed to represent especially long spines of vertebral bodies much longer than in ordinary men. On the right-hand side of the body the backbone is shown with the ribs attached and, on the left, the 2 longitudinal spaces indicate the skin. This spirit is really a kind of bogey, the supposed existence of which is used by the older people to frighten children and youths and prevent them from wandering away from the camp fires at night time. The figure on the right hand is a drawing of a spirit called Awano, plenty of whom live in the rocky ranges in the country of the Gaimbio tribe. It is extremely thin and attenuated and covered all over with hair, called a pimp. There is a great bunch of hair projecting from the back of the head, and from the neck a long, stiff, curved spine hangs down which can be erected and waggled about, so that the natives can hear it making a noise like a rattle. From the wrists, elbows, knees, and ankles lines project ending in knobs, and these represent bones that the spirit has taken from dead men and fastened on itself. From the pelvis there is a downward projection, supposed to represent the mulua, or lightning which the natives always see on the hill tops at night time when the Awano is prowling about. The straight lines above and below the hands and behind and under the feet indicate maggots. The spirits are supposed to wander about in search of dead men whose flesh they eat and can only be frightened away by medicine men. Fig. 81 represents a different type of spirit. This one belongs to the Gaimbio tribe and is supposed to fly about in the daylight or moonlight but not on dark nights. It lives amongst the bamboo trees, hanging on to special ropes made out of banyan bark string, called mokinoborbu. It has flaps projecting from its body, which covered all over with hair, called ngoenbu, and has also two masses called crabber, one on either side of its head. This particular spirit is friendly to the natives and about watching them. If it sees a native ill, out in the bush, it goes to a medicine man and tells him. It is, also, supposed to be Margie, or medicine man itself. In Fig. 82 two spirits belonging to the Gaimbio country, but called Yerubini by the Kakadu people, are drawn. Some of these are women, others are men. They are supposed to live in caves and holes in the ground, or in banyan trees in the jungle, where they sleep at night time, only coming out during the daytime, when they dance about under the tree graves but do not interfere with the bodies. The woman on the left side is drawn with her head in profile showing the long drawn-out mouth and nose above it. Towards daylight they can often be heard singing out, Yerkuta, quick, Koapunji, daylight, Nungoichi, cold. They can be seen by the Margie, or medicine man, wandering about in the bush, the man carrying a basket, drawn hanging from his left shoulder, in which he collects sugar bag, and the woman, who carries a digging stick, searching for turtles and yams. Figure 83 represents a very special spirit which was first seen by a medicine man named Michuambo. It is called Waraguk and is supposed to walk about in the daytime, searching for mormo, or sugar bag. When at rest it lives in the bamboos and paper bark trees, onto which it hangs like a bat. Also it has flaps of skin running on each side of its body from the arms to the legs, by means of which it flies. Its general form has certainly been suggested by that of the flying fox, a large bat that is very commonly met with in the jungle along the river flats in the Kakadu country. Fig. 84 represents three snakes, the two left-hand ones being Narenma and the right hand, Ngabada, a snake that figures largely in the traditions of the Kakadu. Figure 85 is a drawing of an Arab Njori, or large crocodile. Behind the two jaws are the eyes, and behind them is the tongue, or nangel, then follows the neck, or munganumo, which is succeeded by the shoulder, or mundamber, from which the front limbs project. The trunk and tail are remarkable because they are drawn, as it were, in profile so as to show the backbone running along the right side, the scales on the under surface being also indicated. The pelvic region, called parda, is marked by cross lines and has the hind limbs arising from it, and along the right side of the tail the dorsal row of spines is drawn, with the backbone below them. Fig. 86 represents a special, very rare, form of black kangaroo, called Majiborla, that lives amongst the ranges. The native is supposed to have been out searching for mormo, or sugar bag, with which he has filled the Namalka dilly bag that hangs from his neck. On the way back to his camp he is supposed to have met the kangaroo, and is represented running along with his spear thrower, called Poliati, from which he has just hurled his spear. In this, as in many of the drawings, there is no attempt made to indicate the proportionate size of the human being and the animal. Figure 87 is really a composite drawing. On the right-hand side there is a kangaroo, the main figure in the drawing. Behind it there are two male figures, upside down, who have nothing to do with the main scene. Behind them is a man with a spear thrower in his hand, from which he has just thrown the spear that is entering the kangaroo. Behind him, again, follows a woman, whose sex is indicated by her breasts. She carries a digging stick in her hand and a dilly bag hanging from her head. Behind her is a man, evidently following the chase with a spear in his left hand and a spear thrower in his right. In front of the kangaroo is the figure of a man who is supposed to be killing the wounded animal with a club. Fig. 88 represents three quite distinct things. The uppermost is a pygmy goose or peavy, the middle one is a fish, called barrelil, and the lower is the stenciled drawing of a hand. The latter is very often met with, and is made by placing the hand, with the fingers extended flat on a rock, or bark, surface and then blowing either red ochre or white pipe clay over it from the mouth. With the result that an outline drawing of the hand is left on the rock or bark. Much has been written about the so-called red hand, but in reality it has no special significance of any kind whatever. Figure 89 represents a Kimbericura or barramunda fish, Osteoglossum leicardi. Along the back a line of jolly, or flesh, is indicated, below this there is the backbone, and below this again the internal organs. Figure 90 is a drawing of a Gymerabunna, or native companion, Grus australasianus, which has been speared by a native. The relative proportions of the bird are well shown and its internal anatomy indicated. Figure 91 is a most excellent drawing of an old, male, palmate goose, or kernembo. The hard, horny crest on the head, called kandilla, is very characteristically drawn, as is also the beak. The backbone is shown and, though the wings had to be omitted, in order to indicate the internal anatomy, the shoulder girdle is represented by the cross lines, immediately at the base of the neck, along which the esophagus runs. The breast muscles, gizzard, alimentary canal, and pelvic region are clearly outlined. Figure 92 is one of the best of the animal drawings. It represents an echidna, or Urlaryngelura. The strong, compact body, with short legs, is very well expressed, and there is no mistaking its identity. Taking them all together, the bark and rock drawings of the Kakadu, Guimbio, and Amoriya tribes represent, I think, the highest artistic level amongst Australian Aboriginals, with the possible exception of the Melville and Bathurst Islanders, whose art, however, shows indications of the influence of some culture outside that of the Australian continent.